Hello there, my tender night wanderers. Tonight, we drift into the entire story of Eclipse through the worn, wondering eyes of Charlie Swan. He was a small-town police chief, standing at the border of a world he was never invited into, piecing together a picture from shadows and silences and the particular ache of loving someone who is slipping past the reach of your protection. If there's a Twilight story you'd love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I'd love to create it for you. So, settle in. Let your eyes close and let the full story of Eclipse come to you tonight through the steady, watchful soul of Charlie Swan. The grounding started the morning after Bella came home from Italy. Charlie had not slept. He had spent the night in the chair by the front window, the same chair he had sat in during those 4 months when Bella had gone quiet and strange and hollow after Edward Cullen left town. He knew that chair too well by now. He knew the exact angle of the streetlight through the glass, the particular creak of the floorboard beside it, the way the clock on the mantel sounded different at 3 in the morning than it did at any other hour. He had relearned all of it during those months of watching his daughter disappear from the inside out, of carrying dinners upstairs that came back down barely touched, of standing in doorways and not knowing what to say to a girl who had stopped responding to the things fathers usually said. And then she had gone to Italy, for reasons that had been explained to him in words that didn't quite hold together. Something about a misunderstanding. Is something about Edward believing she was dead. About Bella needing to get there in time to stop him from doing something irreversible. Charlie had listened to the explanation with the patience of a man who had spent 2 decades interviewing people who were leaving significant things out. And he had understood, with the quiet certainty that came from professional experience rather than paranoia, that he was being given the outline of a story rather than the story itself. The outline was internally consistent if you didn't press on any single part of it. If you pressed, things shifted. He didn't press. Not that night. She was home, she was breathing. She had that colour back in her face that had been absent for 4 months. And there is a particular species of gratitude that makes a father set his questions on a shelf and simply hold on to the fact that his child is standing in front of him. He had held on to that. He had hugged her longer than he usually did and said something inadequate about being glad she was safe. And then he had gone to sit in the chair by the window because sleep was not a realistic option, and he needed somewhere to put the adrenaline that was still moving through him, like current through a wire. But gratitude, he had discovered, had a shorter half-life than anger. By morning, the relief had cooled into something considerably harder and more familiar. He laid out the rules at the kitchen table over eggs that neither of them touched. The table was small enough that there was nowhere to look that wasn't at each other or at the wall. With Charlie, had always privately felt was one of the better features of the house for conversations that needed to be had rather than avoided. Curfew was 7 on school nights, 9 on weekends, and both of those times were firm and not subject to renegotiation based on circumstances that seemed important in the moment. Phone calls were a privilege rather than a right, and that privilege was currently suspended pending demonstrated trustworthiness, and which Charlie acknowledged was a phrase that sounded like something out of a corporate handbook, but which he meant completely sincerely. No leaving Forks without his explicit and advance permission, with a full accounting of destination, companionship, and expected return time. Edward Cullen was permitted to visit the house, but visits would take place at the house, in spaces where Charlie was present, or at minimum close enough to be present, and would conclude at a reasonable hour that they would define together right now if Bella wanted to avoid surprises later. Bella sat across from him and listened with her hands wrapped around her orange juice glass and her eyes moving between the table and his face with an expression he couldn't entirely read. She didn't argue. She didn't push back or negotiate or do any of the things that would have felt, paradoxically, more reassuring. An argument would have felt like normal. An argument would have felt like the daughter he recognized, the one who had opinions about things and wasn't shy about expressing them. This careful stillness, this measured and almost professional acceptance of terms, felt like someone who had already privately categorized his rules as a temporary inconvenience rather than a genuine constraint. Someone who was agreeing because agreement was the path of least resistance, not because she intended the agreement to mean what it said. He told her that with somewhat less diplomacy than he had intended. She looked up at him then, fully, and he saw something in her face that was harder to name than defiance or resentment, and something closer to sorrow or apology, the expression of someone who understood that they had caused real pain and did not know the mechanism by which to undo it, and was sorry about both the pain and the not knowing. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am." It wasn't nothing. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers for a moment, and she turned her hand over and squeezed back, and then he pushed back his chair and rinsed his plate at the sink and went to work, because there was nothing further to accomplish at the kitchen table that morning, and the town of Forks still needed its police chief, regardless of what was unfolding in his personal life. This was one of the things he had always found clarifying about the job. The world's requirement that he show up and function had gotten him through his divorce, and through Bella's departure for Phoenix, through 4 months of watching her grieve in ways he couldn't reach. It would get him through this too. He called Renee from the station, from his desk, with the door closed. This was not a conversation he had approached with anything resembling confidence. Renee had been the one to call him when Bella disappeared, her voice at a pitch he associated with genuine crisis, and he had spent several hours that day managing his own fear with the tools available to him, which were primarily procedure and forward motion and the deliberate suppression of worst-case thinking, telling her now that everything was fine, that Bella had gone to Italy and come home safely, that the situation had resolved itself without lasting damage. He could hear how thin it all sounded even as the words left his mouth. Mahi was a man who had built a career on the belief that thin explanations deserve scrutiny. Offering one himself felt like a particular kind of hypocrisy. Rene accepted it with a speed that he found, on reflection, more unsettling than reassuring. She expressed relief, asked a handful of questions, made the appropriate noises of a mother who had been frightened and was now less frightened, and then pivoted to asking about Bella's state of mind, whether she seemed happy, whether the situation with Edward seemed stable. Charlie said yes to all of it and felt the specific guilt of answers that were accurate in the narrowest possible sense and deeply incomplete in every other. After he hung up, he sat for a moment with his hand still on the receiver and thought about what it said about both of them, that they were so willing to accept insufficient explanations when it came to their daughter. He thought it probably meant they were both, in their different ways, afraid of the sufficient ones. The days settled into a new pattern, uncomfortable in the way that new patterns always were before they became familiar. Bella went to school, came home, did her homework at the kitchen table, helped with dinner without being asked, and moved through the ordinary architecture of their shared domestic life with the slightly too careful quality of someone who was aware they were being watched and was making a considered effort to be watched well. Charlie appreciated the effort, even as he noted it. He was not, had never been, someone who was easy to perform normalcy at. 20 years of police work had calibrated him for exactly that kind of performance. Edward came to the house on the Wednesday of that first week. He knocked, which Charlie noted and gave him credit for. He stood on the porch and waited, which Charlie also noted. He said good evening and met Charlie's eyes directly and did not attempt to charm or ingratiate himself, which was perhaps the thing that surprised Charlie most. He'd expected some campaign of niceness, some calculated effort to rebuild goodwill. What he got instead was a young man who seemed to understand that goodwill was not currently available, and who wasn't going to insult Charlie's intelligence by pretending otherwise. Charlie let him in. He sat in the armchair across from the couch where Bella and Edward sat, and he watched the game on television, and he was aware with every part of his attention that was not nominally directed at the screen of the two of them on the couch, not in a suspicious way, in the way a man watches something he doesn't fully understand and is trying to read without making his reading obvious. What he saw, watching them, was not what he expected. He expected performance. He expected the careful presentation of a couple who knew they were being observed and were shaping themselves accordingly. What he saw instead was something quieter and in its own way more troubling. Edward Cullen paid attention to Bella in a way that Charlie had never seen a 17-year-old boy pay attention to anything. It was not the distracted, oscillating attention of adolescence. It was total. Or it was the attention of someone for whom the person beside them was the only meaningful object in the room. And Charlie, who was professionally trained to notice where people's attention actually lived as opposed to where they claimed it lived, found this both impossible to dismiss and impossible to categorize. He didn't like Edward Cullen. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, sitting in his armchair with the game on and his daughter on the couch 6 feet away. He didn't like the way his instincts refused to stand down around the boy. He didn't like the quality of stillness Edward had, the sense of someone operating under a constraint that wasn't visible. He didn't like that Bella had nearly fallen apart when Edward left and had apparently been willing to travel to another continent to prevent him from making an irreversible mistake, whatever that meant precisely, because the explanation for that part had been particularly thin. But he also, sitting there, could not locate a specific thing to point to. And 20 years of police work had also taught him that a feeling without evidence was just a feeling, and that acting on feelings without evidence was how innocent people got hurt and guilty ones walked free. Billy Black came by on the Thursday evening of that same week. The visits had a comfortable rhythm that predated Bella's arrival in Forks and would presumably outlast whatever was currently happening in both their domestic lives. They would watch whatever was on, share whatever was in the refrigerator, and talk in the easy shorthand of men who had been friends long enough that silence didn't require explanation. Charlie valued these evenings more than he usually admitted, particularly during stretches when things at home felt complicated in ways he couldn't resolve before bedtime. Billy came alone that Thursday. No Jacob, which was itself a small piece of information. He settled onto the couch with the ease of someone who had sat in that spot so many times that it had shaped itself to him, and they watched the first half of the game without speaking about anything that mattered. And then, during the break, Billy said, in the particular register he used when he was steering towards something, that he was glad Bella was home. Charlie said he was glad too. Billy said that the Cullen family had a history of drawing people into situations that were more complicated than they appeared, and that this wasn't necessarily anyone's fault, but that it was a pattern worth being aware of. Charlie turned to look at him. "You've said versions of that to me before." "I've meant versions of that before," Billy said. His eyes stayed on the television. "Is there something you're actually trying to tell me?" The pause that followed was long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then Billy said, "I'm trying to tell you that your instincts about that family are sound, and that you should keep listening to them." It wasn't the specific thing Charlie was asking for. It was also not nothing. He filed it in the same mental space where he kept all the other fragments Billy had offered him over the years, lest the careful half-statements and meaningful pauses and things said in tones that carried more weight than the words themselves. He had enough of these fragments now that he could feel their collective shape even if he couldn't see what they added up to. He was not, he decided that night after Billy had gone home, in a hurry to see what they added up to. The evenings remained the hardest part of those first weeks, not because they were difficult in any specific way, because they weren't quite. Bella was present, home before curfew, eating dinner, doing the dishes, behaving in every externally observable sense like a daughter who was making a genuine effort. But there was a quality to her presence that reminded him, not comfortably, of those months after Edward's first departure. Not the same grief, nothing like that hollow absence, had something different, something more like a person whose center of gravity had shifted, who moved through the rooms of the house as though these rooms were not quite where her life was actually taking place. He tried several times in those early weeks to have the kind of conversation he felt a father was supposed to be able to have. He asked about her plans after graduation and received answers that were carefully vague. He asked whether she had given any further thought to the University of Alaska, which Carlisle Cullen had apparently recommended, and which was near enough to constitute a compromise and far enough to constitute some kind of independent life. And she said she was thinking about it, in a tone that meant she was not thinking about it. He asked her once, on a Sunday evening when the house was quiet and the rain was soft against the windows, and it seemed like the right kind of moment. Whether she was happy. She said yes, and he looked at her face when she said it, and believed her, and didn't believe her in the same breath, because what she was certain. Certain, the way people were certain when they had made a decision that could not be unmade. And certainty and happiness occupied similar expressions without being the same thing. He lay awake that night listening to the rain, and did what he had always done when sleep wouldn't come, which was work the problem. He turned it over the way he turned over cases that hadn't resolved. What did he have? What did he know? What was the shape of the thing he was looking at from the wrong angle? He had a daughter who had come back to herself, truly come back. Not the hollow performance of okayness that had preceded Italy. Only after the return of the boy he didn't trust. He had a boy he didn't trust who paid attention to that daughter with an intensity that was not normal, and who nevertheless could not be accused of any specific wrong. He had a friend who kept telling him his instincts were right, without telling him what his instincts were right about. He had an explanation for Italy that accounted for the facts and explained nothing. He had, mostly, a daughter who was home. He got up and went downstairs and checked the front door and the back door, and stood for a moment in the kitchen in the dark. The porch light was on. It was always on now. He had started leaving it on during those 4 months when Bella had gone so quiet, had some instinct toward visibility, toward making the house findable in the dark. He went back to bed. He thought he would probably lie awake for another hour. He was asleep in 10 minutes, the particular sleep of a man who has decided, for tonight at least, that the things he cannot resolve will keep until morning. Edward Cullen came to the house on a Wednesday evening, 3 days into the grounding, and knocked on the front door like someone who understood that knocking was no longer a formality, but a declaration of intent. Charlie had been expecting it. Not on that specific evening, not at that precise hour, but in the general way that a man expects weather he can feel building before it arrives. Edward had left Forks months ago without so much as a conversation, and had removed himself and his entire family from Bella's life with a cleanness that Charlie had privately, guiltily, been relieved by at the time. The relief had not lasted. What followed the relief had been 4 months of watching his daughter hollow out from the inside, 4 months of untouched dinners and manufactured okayness, and the particular grief of a parent who can see exactly what is wrong and cannot reach it. And then Edward had come back, and Bella had gone to Italy, and now here they were again, back at the beginning of something Charlie didn't have a complete name for, and he had known from the moment Bella walked back through his front door with that particular recovered light in her eyes that this knock was coming. He opened the door on the second knock. Edward stood on the porch in the grey early evening light with his hands at his sides and his posture neither defensive nor aggressive, simply present. He was not smiling in the manufactured way that people smiled when they were consciously trying to make an impression. He met Charlie's eyes directly and said good evening, and then he waited. That was all. No carefully constructed opener designed to ease the tension. No charm deployed strategically at the threshold. Just a young man standing in the rain who seemed to understand, without it needing to be said, the precise nature of the ground beneath his feet and what it would take to be allowed to stand on it. Charlie looked at him for a long moment. He was good at long moments. 20 years of police work had made him comfortable with silence in ways that other people often weren't. I had taught him that the space between a question and an answer frequently told you more than the answer itself. Edward Cullen did not fill the silence. He stood in it with the same unnerving stillness he always had. The quality Charlie had never been able to adequately explain to himself. The sense of someone whose relationship with physical space was subtly but fundamentally different from everyone else's. Charlie stepped back and opened the door wider. He did not say welcome. He said Bella was upstairs and she could come down, and that he would be in the living room, and that he trusted Edward remembered the conditions they had discussed regarding these visits. Edward said yes, sir, he remembered, and came inside without any of the relieved loosening that most people showed when tension broke in their favor. He came inside the way he did everything, with that same quality of absolute control. And Charlie went back to his armchair with the feeling of a man who has made a tactical decision he isn't entirely at peace with, but cannot identify a smarter alternative to. He kept the television on. He watched it with roughly 40% of his attention and directed the remainder toward the couch in his peripheral vision, where Bella had appeared within 3 minutes of Edward's arrival, which told Charlie she had been listening for him, and where she now sat with a distance between them that Charlie understood was being maintained specifically for his benefit. He noted this. He noted most things. It was not a habit he had ever successfully turned off. The professional observer's reflex to catalogue and file and return to later. What he observed over the course of that first evening did not match what he had prepared himself to see. He had expected performance. The carefully calibrated presentation of a couple who were aware of being watched and were shaping themselves accordingly, the way people shape themselves in interview rooms when they knew there was a camera. What he got instead was something that didn't behave like a performance, which was in its own way considerably more troubling. Edward sat at the far end of the couch with his hands in his lap and paid attention to Bella in a way that Charlie, across 2 decades of watching people in every conceivable state of feeling, had rarely witnessed directed by one person toward another. It was not the restless, glancing attention of someone his age. It was not the divided attention of someone who was also managing their own thoughts and concerns and running internal calculations. It was total. It was the attention of someone for whom everything else in the room had become, in the most literal sense, background. And this was the part that Charlie kept returning to. Not the hungry, acquisitive attention of a teenage boy who wanted something. It was quieter than that. It was the attention of someone for whom the wanting had already resolved into something else, something settled and absolute. And Charlie, who had spent 20 years learning to read people, found this more unsettling than desire would have been. Desire was understandable. He knew what to do with desire. This was something he didn't have a clean category for. He didn't like it any better for being real. After Edward left, at precisely the agreed time without any negotiation or lingering at the door, Charlie sat in his chair for a while in the quiet of the house and tried again to locate the specific thing that bothered him about the boy. He preferred specifics. A feeling without a specific attachment point was not, in his experience, actionable, and he was a man who preferred his concerns to be actionable. But what he came back to, turning it over the way he turned over evidence, he could feel the significance of before he understood it, was the same formless thing he always came back to with Edward Cullen. Something that didn't fit inside the frame of what the boy appeared to be. Something in the quality of his stillness, in the precision of his movements, had the sense of a person who was exercising a very specific and very constant discipline whose nature and source Charlie could not identify. It was not the stillness of someone naturally calm. Charlie knew naturally calm people. He was, on his better days, one of them. This was different. This was the stillness of someone for whom stillness was a practice rather than a state. Something maintained rather than inhabited. He knew that kind of stillness too. He had seen it in people who were managing pain, or managing fear, or managing something they could not afford to let show in a situation where showing it would cost them something significant. He went to bed without resolving it. This was, he was coming to accept. Simply how his evenings ended when Edward Cullen had been in his house and Jacob Black came by on the Saturday of that same week. And the difference between that arrival and Edward's was so complete that Charlie felt it before Jacob had even made it fully up the porch steps. He heard the truck first, the particular sound of it, and something in his chest loosened without him making any decision to let it. He was at the door before Jacob knocked. Jacob had grown again, or at least that was how it seemed. Though Charlie was fairly certain a person couldn't grow that visibly in the span of weeks. He filled the door frame in a way that was new or newly obvious, and he carried himself with a straightness that had not been there before, a physical confidence that sat on him naturally rather than being performed. He looked, Charlie thought, like someone who had been given a significant weight to carry and had found, to their own surprise, that they were strong enough for it. There was a tiredness beneath that, a particular kind of tiredness that Charlie associated with people who were doing something that mattered and that cost them. But it did not diminish the impression. If anything, it deepened it. "Hey, Charlie," Jacob said, and smiled. And it was the uncomplicated smile of someone who genuinely meant it. And Charlie felt something he rarely let himself feel consciously, which was the specific grief of a father who can see exactly what his daughter is walking away from. He opened the door wide and said, "Come in," and meant it without qualification. Bella, it turned out, was not home. She had gone to the Cullen house that afternoon, which Charlie had permitted under the modified terms of the grounding, and which he was, and standing here looking at Jacob's carefully composed face, somewhat less comfortable with than he had been at the time of granting permission. He told Jacob this simply and directly, because Jacob deserved the directness and because Charlie was not a man who softened things unnecessarily. Something crossed Jacob's face. It was brief and it was controlled and it was gone before most people would have caught it. Charlie caught it. It was not quite hurt and not quite anger and not quite resignation, but contained elements of all three. And beneath all three was something raw that Jacob was clearly not going to let into the room if he could help it. "That's fine," Jacob said, and his voice was easy in the way that voices were when ease was a deliberate choice. "I was in the area. No big thing." Charlie very much doubted he had been in the area. La Push was not a place you passed through on the way to anywhere in Forks. But he did not say this because the saying of it would have forced Jacob to either maintain a pretense that both of them could see through, or abandon it and acknowledged something he was clearly not ready to acknowledge, and neither option served either of them. "Come watch the game," Charlie said instead. "I made chili." Jacob came in and sat on the couch and ate 2 bowls of chili and most of the crackers in the house, and Charlie watched him eat with a particular satisfaction of feeding someone who was genuinely hungry, which Jacob always was, with an appetite that seemed to belong to something larger than his already considerable frame. And they watched the first half of the game in the easy silence of people who did not need to fill space with words to feel comfortable in each other's company, which was a quality Charlie found genuinely rare and genuinely valuable. During the break, Charlie asked how Billy was doing. Jacob said fine, same as always, keeping busy. He said it with a slight compression of a person giving the abbreviated answer to a question that had a considerably longer one attached to it, and Charlie noted the compression and set it aside for now. He asked how Jacob was doing. Jacob was quiet for a moment that lasted slightly longer than the question warranted. Then he said he was good, staying busy, lots going on at the reservation. How he said it with the tone of someone who was being truthful about the surface of things while leaving the depth entirely unaddressed. And Charlie, who had conducted a career's worth of conversations that operated on exactly that principle, recognized the architecture of it clearly. "What kind of things?" Charlie asked. He kept his voice neutral, the way he kept his voice neutral in interviews when he wanted an answer, but didn't want to signal how much he wanted it. Jacob looked at him with an expression that was equal parts consideration and apology. "Just stuff with the tribe," he said. "Community things. Hard to explain." And then, with a slight shift in his face that Charlie read as a genuine attempt at honesty within the constraints he was operating under. "It's important though. What we're doing, it matters." Charlie nodded slowly, or he believed him. Whatever Jacob and the boys on the reservation were doing, he believed it mattered, and he believed it was important, and he believed it was also something that Jacob could not explain to him in any terms Charlie was currently equipped to receive. He had been accumulating that particular belief for several weeks now, the sense that the young men of La Push were carrying something real and serious beneath their new physical confidence and their careful non-explanations. He did not push. Some doors, he had learned, were better left for later, when you had more of the picture, when the person on the other side was ready to open them from their side, which was always the easier direction. Instead, he said, "Bella misses you. I know she's not showing it the way she should, but she does." Jacob looked at the television, and his jaw tightened slightly. "She's got other priorities right now," he said, and the even delivery of it told Charlie more about how much it cost him than any amount of visible feeling would have. "Jake." Charlie waited until the boy looked at him. "Don't give up on her. Whatever's happening right now, don't make it permanent." Jacob held his gaze for a moment, and Charlie saw something move through his expression that was complicated and young and old at the same time. Then he nodded, a single small movement, and looked back at the screen. They finished the game. Jacob helped carry the bowls to the kitchen without being asked, which was the kind of thing that was small and entirely revealing. And then he said he should head back and thank Charlie for the food and the company with a warmth that was entirely unperformed and that made the room feel immediately emptier when he left. Charlie walked him to the door and stood on the porch while Jacob went down the steps. At the bottom, Jacob paused and turned back, and in the grey evening light he looked younger than he had inside, or more unguarded, the composure slightly thinner at the edges, and Charlie had the strong, clear impression of someone who was carrying an enormous weight with a grace that was real, but that was also costing him every single day. "She's going to be okay, right?" Jacob said. "You think she's going to be okay?" Charlie looked at him steadily. "That's what I'm working toward," he said. "Every day." Jacob nodded once, the same small, tight movement as before. Swan got into his truck and pulled out of the driveway and drove away down the wet street. Charlie stood on the porch and watched until the truck was gone, and then stood a moment longer in the cool, damp air, the sound of the rain beginning again in the trees at the edge of the yard. He thought about the difference between the two visits. The controlled, disciplined stillness of one boy and the effortful composure of the other. The way Bella had materialized at the top of the stairs within minutes for one and had been absent for the other. The way Charlie's chest felt in the presence of each and in the aftermath of each. The tightening and the loosening, the alert unease and the sad relief. He called Billy that evening, not to discuss any of it specifically, just because he had learned over many years of friendship that some phone calls were about the fact of connection rather than its content. Billy answered quickly and sounded genuinely pleased, and they talked for the better part of an hour about the fishing season and the dock repair and several other things that were entirely real and entirely beside the actual point of the call. Near the end, Billy said that he appreciated Charlie keeping an eye on things. Charlie said he wasn't entirely sure what things he was keeping an eye on. Billy said, "More than you think. That's all." Charlie sat with that after he hung up. He sat with all of it, the two visits and the two boys and his daughter's absence from one and presence for the other, and the weight Jacob carried and the discipline Edward maintained, and the thing Billy kept almost saying and then not quite saying. He sat with the map of it that was forming in his mind, still incomplete, still missing too many pieces to show him the full picture. He checked the locks before he went to bed. Front door, back door, the kitchen window. He turned on the porch light. He always turned on the porch light. Whatever was out there in the dark, whatever was moving at the edges of the life his daughter was living, Charlie Swan was still here, still watching, still leaving the light on. That was what he had. That was what he could give her. And on the nights when it felt insufficient, which were most of them, he reminded himself that it was also real and constant, and hers whenever she needed it. He went upstairs. The house was quiet. The rain continued against the windows, steady and soft, the way it always did in Forks, as though it had nowhere else to be and no particular reason to hurry. The call started the second week. Charlie initiated the first one himself, standing in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening while Bella was upstairs doing homework, or at least occupying the same room as her homework, which was not necessarily the same thing. He'd been thinking about Jacob since Saturday, about the truck pulling out of the driveway, and the question the boy had asked on the porch steps, and the careful way he had eaten his chili and watched the game and maintained the performance of everything being essentially fine, with the discipline of someone for whom nothing was especially fine at the moment. Hickey picked up the phone and dialed Bella's number from the pad beside the refrigerator and listened to it ring upstairs, which was an experience he found faintly absurd given the size of the house. And when she answered, he said, without preamble, "Have you called Jacob?" There was a pause, the specific kind of pause that contained an answer before any words arrived. "Not yet," Bella said. "It's been almost 2 weeks since you've spoken to him." "I know, Dad. He came by on Saturday, while you were out." Another pause, shorter this time, but with more texture in it. "I know. You mentioned it. I'm mentioning it again," Charlie said, "because I don't think it landed properly the first time." He heard her exhale slowly on the other end of the line. It was the exhale of someone exercising patience in a way that required visible effort, which was not, Charlie thought, the appropriate direction for patience to be flowing in this particular conversation. He was the parent. The patience was supposed to be his. The fact that she was deploying it at him suggested she had already made certain decisions and was waiting for him to finish raising objections she had already considered and set aside. "I'll call him," she said. "Soon." "Tonight would be better than soon," Charlie said. She said she would try, in the tone of someone who intended to try approximately as hard as necessary to satisfy the immediate requirement and no harder. And Charlie said good night and set the phone down and stood in the kitchen for a moment, with his hand still resting on the receiver. He was reasonably certain she would not call Jacob that evening. He was considerably less certain what, if anything, he could do about that, which was the central and recurring frustration of parenting a 17-year-old who had already determined what mattered to her and was not especially interested in revisiting that determination. He made a cup of coffee he didn't need and drank half of it standing at the sink looking out at the dark backyard, the tree line barely visible in the rain. The situation with Jacob was, in Charlie's private and talking about whatever held his attention that week, with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a child who had not yet learned to edit himself for other people's benefit. That quality had not disappeared as Jacob grew. It had deepened, had become less about enthusiasm and more about a genuine and unguarded warmth that Charlie found increasingly rare the older he got, and the more people he encountered in the course of his work. And Bella had been better with Jacob. That was the simple and observable truth that Charlie kept returning to when he tried to make sense of her current direction. During those 4 months after Edward left, the hollow months, the sleepwalking and the silence and the midnight sounds, that Charlie still could not think about without something cold and specific moving through him. Jacob had been the thing that reached her. Charlie did not fully understand the mechanism. He only knew what he had watched, which was his daughter beginning to come back to herself in direct and visible correlation with the time she was spending in La Push, and that whatever Jacob was giving her during those months, it was the nearest thing to actual medicine the situation had produced. He had been grateful for it in the wordless, bone-deep way that parents were grateful for things that saved their children when they themselves had run out of ways to help, and now she was letting it go, setting it down with the same calm purposefulness with which she seemed to be making every decision since Italy, as though she had already seen the whole picture and was simply moving through the remaining steps as efficiently as possible, and the people and things she was moving past were not being abandoned so much as left behind, which was a distinction that probably felt meaningful from her side and felt entirely insufficient from where Charlie was standing. It made him angry, not at Bella specifically, or not only at Bella, at the situation, at the shape of things, at the particular helplessness of watching your child make choices that were going to cost them and not being able to insert yourself between the choice and the cost. Anger was, he had long understood, the form that helplessness took in him when helplessness had nowhere else to go. The following Thursday, Jacob came by again without announcement. Charlie answered the door and found him on the porch in the early evening, with his hands in the front pocket of his sweatshirt, and the particular expression of someone who had driven a significant distance, telling themselves they were just passing by. Charlie stepped back without comment and gestured him inside, and Jacob came in with the easy physical confidence that was new to him these past months, the bearing of someone who had grown into a responsibility and discovered they were equal to it. "Is she home?" Jacob asked. "She is," Charlie said. "Sit down, I'll get her." He went upstairs and knocked on Bella's door and told her Jacob was here. He watched her face when he said it, the way he always watched her face, with the attention of a man who had learned that faces told the truth when voices were being careful. He saw something move through her expression that was not simple. It was layered in the way that real feelings were layered, something that could have been guilt, and could have been genuine affection, and could have been the discomfort of someone who understood they were not behaving as well as they were capable of behaving. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll be right down." He went back to the kitchen and busied himself with things that needed doing, keeping himself in earshot without positioning himself as an audience. He heard their voices in the living room, low and slightly careful, the rhythm of a conversation feeling for solid ground. Bella's tone was soft in the apologetic register he recognized from conversations where she knew she was in the wrong and was trying to account for it without fully addressing it. Jacob's voice was warm beneath something compressed, something that was making a sustained effort to stay below the surface. After about 25 minutes, he heard the front door open and close. He came into the hallway and found Bella standing with her back to the closed door and her arms folded across her chest, and an expression that he had not seen on her face in some time, something quieter and less certain than her usual composure. "How did it go?" Charlie asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Fine," she said. "Just fine." She looked at him with the expression of someone who knew they were being read and was too tired to perform around it. "It's complicated, Dad." "I know it's complicated," Charlie said. "Complicated doesn't mean you get to stop trying." She looked at the floor for a moment. "I'm not stopping trying. I'm just trying to figure out how to be fair to everyone at the same time." "And how's that going?" She didn't answer that. He hadn't really expected her to. She said goodnight and went back upstairs, and Charlie stood in the hallway alone and listened to the sound of her door and the silence that settled after it. He called Billy from the station the following Friday on his lunch break. "Is Jake doing all right?" he asked without building up to it. He had found, over years of friendship with Billy, that building up to things with Billy was largely unnecessary. Billy was quiet in the considering way he had, the pause of a man who was deciding how much of what he knew to offer. "He's managing," he said finally. "Managing and okay aren't the same thing," Charlie said. "No," Billy agreed. "They're not. He keeps coming by here. He's trying with her, Billy. more than she's meeting him. I know, Billy said, and there was something in his voice that was both sad and proud. In a combination Charlie recognized as specific to parents watching their children do something hard with more grace than anyone had a right to expect. He's stronger than the situation deserves, if I'm being honest. Does he talk to you about it? Some, Billy said. Not everything. He keeps most of it to himself. He paused again. He's carrying a lot right now, Charlie. More than just Bella. There are things happening that I can't explain fully. But he's got real responsibilities right now. Real ones. And he's stepping up to them. Charlie absorbed this. What kind of responsibilities? The kind that are his to carry, Billy said, gently but firmly. And then Charlie understood that this was the edge of what Billy was going to give him, and that pushing past it would only produce a more formal version of the same refusal. Is he safe? Charlie asked. It was the simpler question, the one that mattered most when the others ran out. Billy said he knows what he's doing, which was not quite the same as yes, but which carried enough of the same weight that Charlie allowed it to settle him slightly. He thanked Billy and hung up and sat at his desk for a moment in the particular quiet of a conversation that had told him something important without telling him anything specific. He thought about Jacob's face on his porch. He thought about Billy's voice saying he's carrying a lot and meaning it in a way that went beyond the ordinary. He thought about the boys on the reservation, the way they moved together, the organized purposefulness of them that he had noticed on the few occasions he had seen them in a group. There was something there that was larger than friendship and more structured than it should have been for their age. And Charlie had been filing pieces of that observation away for weeks without having enough context to assemble them into anything coherent. The weeks continued in this way. Bella went to school and to the Cullen house on permitted days and moved through the kitchen and the living room with that quality of elsewhere attention that Charlie had catalogued and not resolved. Jacob came when he came, unpredictably, sometimes staying an hour, and sometimes only long enough to establish that Bella was otherwise occupied, and each visit was shorter than the one before it, and quieter in a way that was not the quietness of comfort, but of things being set down carefully to avoid breakage. Charlie pushed when the openings existed. He mentioned Jacob at dinner with the regularity of a man making a sustained and only partially successful effort. He relayed information between them in both directions, the small connective gestures of someone trying to keep a bridge from closing entirely. He told Bella, more than once and with increasing directness, that the friendship with Jacob was not something she could simply deprioritize indefinitely and expect to find waiting for her when she eventually turned back around. She listened with the expression of someone who understood he was right and had decided to carry that understanding quietly rather than act on it. And she went to La Push once, on a Wednesday afternoon when Edward was at the Cullen house. She was gone 2 hours and came back with an expression that was complicated in ways she was not prepared to narrate, and said it had been good and fine, and that things were going to be okay. And Charlie looked at her face and believed some of that and set the rest aside. He made dinner. They ate together and talked about her classes and the weather and other things that were real and present and beside the point of what both of them were actually carrying. And Charlie thought about what it meant to love someone who was moving toward a life you couldn't follow them into. He thought about the particular education of it, the way it clarified what was and wasn't within his reach, and the things that were his to offer and the things that belonged entirely to her. That night he sat on the porch before bed. The rain had paused in the brief, tentative way it paused in Forks, not stopping so much as reconsidering. The air was cool and smelled like pine and wet earth, and the particular cleanness of a forest after rain. He thought about Jacob asking if Bella was going to be okay. He thought about Billy saying, "Not just a kid, not anymore." He thought about what was being carried by people younger than they should have to be carrying it, and what that cost, and how little he could do about any of it from where he stood. He stayed on the porch until the rain returned. Then he went inside and checked the locks and turned on the porch light. He went upstairs. The house was quiet around him, had the good, solid quiet of a house that was still standing, still functioning, still a place a person could come home to. Outside, the rain fell on Forks the way it always did. Patient, steady, as though it understood that some things simply required the time they required, and there was no wisdom in hurrying any of it along. The reports started coming out of Seattle in early spring, and Charlie noticed them the way he noticed most things that happened beyond his jurisdiction, but within his professional awareness, quietly, consistently, with the particular attention of a man who understood that what happened in one place had a reliable habit of eventually arriving in another. The first reports were easy enough to categorize. A missing persons case in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. A young man last seen leaving a bar on a Thursday night. And then another. A woman in her mid-20s who had not shown up for a shift at the hospital where she worked and had not been heard from since. Missing persons were not unusual in a city the size of Seattle. People disappeared for reasons that were sad and mundane and thoroughly explainable, and Charlie had worked enough of those cases across his career to know that the majority resolved within 72 hours, and that the ones that didn't usually had explanations that were tragic rather than mysterious. He noted the Seattle cases the way he noted weather patterns and regional crime statistics as background information that a responsible law enforcement officer maintained awareness of without necessarily acting on. But then the bodies started turning up. The first one made the regional news on a Tuesday morning in March. Charlie was at the kitchen counter with his coffee and the television on at low volume. The way he kept it most mornings, background noise that occasionally produced something worth attending to. He heard the anchor say Seattle and turned up the volume and stood with his coffee going cold in his hand and watched the rest of the segment with the focused stillness he reserved for things that registered in the professional part of his mind as genuinely significant. A body recovered near the waterfront. A young man. The injuries described in the careful euphemistic language that morning news programs deployed when the reality was too specific for the hour. Words like extensive trauma and severe damage and injuries inconsistent with the known causes, which was the language of people who had seen something they did not yet have a framework for and were not ready to present a framework-less thing to the public. Charlie turned off the television when the segment ended and finished his coffee standing at the sink and looked out at the backyard in the grey morning light and thought about the phrase injuries inconsistent with known causes for longer than the drive to work usually allowed him to think about anything. At the station, he pulled up the Seattle Police Department's public-facing reports and read what was available. Active investigation. No suspects identified. Public encouraged to exercise awareness, particularly in the affected neighborhoods during evening hours. The language of a department that had more questions than answers and had not yet determined what shape its answers were going to need to take. He bookmarked the page and went about his day and checked it again before he left that evening. Nothing new. He drove home in the particular grey of a Forks late afternoon and made dinner and sat across from Bella and did not mention it because there was nothing specific enough to mention yet, and because he had learned over the months since Italy that conversations with Bella went better when he brought specifics rather than impressions. The following week there was another body. The week after that, 2 more. The pace of it was wrong in a way Charlie registered physically before he registered it intellectually, shed a tightening in the chest that came from pattern recognition, operating ahead of conscious analysis. This was not the random distribution of unrelated incidents. The frequency was too consistent. The geographic clustering was too deliberate. And the injuries, what was being reported of them, carried the same language across each case, the same careful euphemisms, the same professional reluctance to commit to a cause or a mechanism. Whatever was happening in Seattle, it was happening in a way that the people whose job it was to explain things were finding very difficult to explain. He brought it up with his deputy Mark on a Wednesday afternoon, when the station was quiet and the coffee was fresh and the conditions were as good as they were likely to get for a conversation that was more thinking out loud than formal briefing. "You've been following the Seattle situation," Charlie said. It was not quite a question. Mark looked up from his desk. "Since the 3rd body," he said. "The frequency bothered me." "The frequency bothered me too," Charlie said. "What else?" Mark set down his pen with the deliberateness of a man shifting from one mode to another. "The damage profile on the recovered victims is inconsistent across case files in ways that don't make sense if you're looking at a single perpetrator using consistent methods. But it's also consistent across case files in ways that don't make sense if you're looking at random, unrelated incidents." He paused. "It's like looking at something that follows rules you don't have access to." Charlie looked at him. "That's a strange way to put it." "It's the most accurate way I could find," Mark said. The King County ME apparently used the word unprecedented in her formal report, multiple times. "I heard that," Charlie said, "from Patterson at the Olympia meeting." "Then you know it means they're not just stumped. They're stumped in a way they haven't been before." Mark picked up his pen again. "FBI's running point now, which means Seattle PD has accepted that whatever framework they were using wasn't adequate." Charlie nodded and went back to his desk and looked at the map on the wall. He had started adding markers 2 weeks earlier, small pins at the locations of the reported incidents, and the cluster they formed was not static. It was drifting, southward mostly, with an occasional eastern variation that brought it marginally closer to the Cascades before pulling back toward the coast. At its current rate of movement, at the outermost edge of the pattern would reach the general region of Clallam County within 6 to 8 weeks. This was, by any reasonable measure, not a comfortable projection. He drove the northern county roads that evening after his shift, a habit he had developed gradually over the preceding weeks without making a formal decision to develop it. He told himself it was general due diligence, the natural attentiveness of a police chief who wanted to know his territory. He understood, honestly, that it was something more directed than that, though what precisely he was looking for he could not have stated in terms that would have survived professional scrutiny. The forest on the northern roads was different at night than it was during the day, which was obvious enough to be unremarkable, but different also from how it had been on these same roads 6 months ago, which was the thing that kept pulling him back. There was a quality to it that he had been trying to name for weeks without finding the right word. Not threatening exactly, not dangerous in any way he could point to. More like the quality of a room where someone has recently been standing, the faint residual sense of occupation even after the occupant has gone. He drove slowly with his window partly down and the heater running, and listened to the forest the way he had learned to listen to rooms and people and situations that were telling him something he didn't yet have the vocabulary for. He pulled over at the wide point in the road above the old Garrett farm and turned off his lights and sat in the complete rural dark for a long time, listening, and the forest was quiet, specifically quiet, the quietness not of absence, but of things that had stopped moving and were waiting. He had heard this quality of quiet before, in the woods during hunting season, when a large animal was close enough that everything smaller had gone still. He sat with it until the cold came through the window in a way that was no longer ignorable, and then started the car and drove home. Bella was doing homework at the kitchen table when he came in, or at least the homework was on the table in front of her, and she was looking at it. She looked up when he entered with the particular alertness of someone who had been waiting rather than working, though she did a reasonable job of presenting it as the former. "Late," she said. "Did a loop up north," he said, hanging up his jacket. She watched him cross to the refrigerator and get the water pitcher and pour a glass and drink half of it standing at the counter. Her eyes tracked him with an attention that he noted and did not acknowledge. "Anything going on up there?" she asked, and the casualness of it was careful in a way that casual things usually weren't. "Animal disturbance reports," he said. "Nothing specific, just keeping an eye on things." She looked back at her homework. "That makes sense," she said, in the tone of someone confirming something rather than receiving information. He sat down across from her. He looked at her bent over the textbook, the particular angle of her shoulders, the way her pen was not quite moving. "Belle," he said. She looked up. "Is there anything you want to tell me? About anything that's been going on? And anything you've heard or noticed?" The pause was very brief, barely a pause at all to someone who wasn't watching for it. "No," she said. "Why?" "Just asking," he said. She held his gaze with the steady composure she developed over the past months, the composure that looked like openness but functioned like a wall, and then she looked back down at her textbook. "I'm fine, Dad. Everything's fine." He went to bed without pressing it further. He had learned slowly and with some resistance that pressing Bella when she had decided not to share something was an expenditure of effort that produced nothing except the deterioration of the atmosphere between them, and he valued the atmosphere between them too much to spend it on conversations that were going nowhere. He drove up to Olympia the following week for the quarterly regional coordination meeting and found, as he had expected to find, that the Seattle situation was consuming every informal conversation the formal agenda wasn't occupying. He sought out Patterson deliberately, found her in the hallway during the morning break, and they stood together with their coffee in the particular way of two people who had things to say that the room behind them was not the right place to say. Patterson looked more tired than she had at the last meeting, the specific tiredness of someone working a case that was actively resisting being worked. "How bad is it?" Charlie asked. She looked at him with the expression of someone deciding how much professional frankness the situation warranted. "It's bad in a way that's hard to brief upward," she said. "And every time we think we have a framework for it, another incident happens that breaks the framework. The FBI profilers have produced 3 separate profiles in 6 weeks. Each one supersedes the previous one. Each one is less confident than the last." "The injuries," Charlie said. "The ME reports." "Still unprecedented," Patterson said flatly. "We brought in a second specialist, independent. She looked at everything and came back to us and said, and I'm quoting directly here, that the damage was consistent with a force she did not have a professional category for." She paused. "A force she did not have a professional category for, in a forensic report, in 2005. Charlie was quiet for a moment. "What's the working theory?" "Officially, multiple perpetrators, possibly organized, possibly with access to resources or capabilities we haven't identified." She drank her coffee. "Unofficially, nobody wants to say what they're thinking because what they're thinking doesn't fit inside a professional document without sounding like something else entirely." Charlie drove back to Forks with the windows down and the heater off, despite the cold, and thought about what fit inside professional documents and what didn't, and what happened to the things that didn't fit, whether they disappeared or simply accumulated in the spaces between the official language, building up like pressure behind a door that was being held shut by consensus and habit, and the professional necessity of having frameworks that worked. He thought about the forest on the northern roads, the quality of waiting in its quiet. He thought about Bella's fork moving through her food when he mentioned Seattle. He thought about her pen not moving over her homework when he came in from the late patrol. He thought about the way she said everything's fine in the tone of someone describing a situation they were monitoring rather than inhabiting. He thought about Billy Black saying your instincts are sound and meaning considerably more than the words contained. At the station the following morning, he stood in front of his map for a long time without adding anything to it. The pins were already telling him what they were telling him. Adding more pins was not going to change the message. The message was that something was moving through the region between Seattle and Forks in a pattern that did not have a conventional explanation, and that the conventional explanations being offered by the people whose job it was to provide them were visibly and increasingly inadequate, and that whatever it was getting closer. He was a police chief in a small town with a small department and a jurisdiction that covered roughly 400 square miles of forest and coastline and 2,000 permanent residents. He had a badge and a sidearm and 20 years of experience with human behavior and its consequences. He had, outside those things, no particular resources for addressing something that forensic specialists in a major metropolitan area could not find professional categories for. He poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and sat down at his desk and opened his email and began working through the ordinary accumulated business of a Tuesday morning in Forks, Washington. Because that was what he had. The ordinary business, the jurisdiction he could actually cover, the town that was his to protect with the tools he actually possessed. But he kept the map on the wall. He kept adding to it when new information came. He kept driving the northern roads in the evenings, windows down, listening to the forest that knew something was in it before he did. And every night, without exception, he turned on the porch light before he went to bed, because Bella was in that house. Because whatever was out there in the dark and the trees and the inadequate professional frameworks of the King County Medical Examiner's office, his daughter was in that house, and the light was on, and the door was unlocked, and he was awake longer than he should have been most nights, lying in the dark and listening to the rain and thinking about the distance between what his badge covered and what it didn't. The distance he was finding was considerable. It was also increasingly personal, and the approach of graduation had a particular quality in a small town that it didn't have anywhere else, or at least that was Charlie's experience of it. Having lived his entire adult life in places where everyone knew everyone, and milestones were therefore communal in a way that felt both warm and slightly suffocating. Forks High School graduating class sizes ran somewhere between 40 and 60 students, depending on the year, which meant that every parent in that gymnasium on graduation night would know most of the other parents, would have some memory or association attached to most of the names being called, would feel the collective weight of the occasion in a way that larger schools with larger classes simply couldn't produce. It was one of the things Charlie had always quietly valued about small-town life, the way significant moments were witnessed rather than merely attended. He'd been thinking about Bella's graduation for months, not obsessively, not in the way that Renee thought about it, who had called 3 separate times in April alone to discuss dress options and photograph logistics with an enthusiasm that suggested she was planning a state dinner rather than a high school ceremony. Charlie's thinking was quieter and less logistical and considerably more anxious in ways he had not fully admitted to himself, until he sat down one evening in late April with his coffee going cold on the end table, and understood that what he was feeling was not anticipatory pride, but something closer to dread. Not dread of the graduation itself, dread of what came after it. Bella was going to leave. This was not a new understanding. Children left. That was the design of the thing, the intended outcome of raising someone, that they eventually became capable of departing. Charlie had understood this intellectually since before Bella had come to live with him, and he had understood it personally and practically in the months since, watching her move through her senior year with the quality of someone who was already partly somewhere else. But understanding a thing intellectually and feeling its approach as a physical weight were different experiences, and the weight had been building since March and was now, in May, sitting on his chest, with enough presence that he noticed it most mornings before he was fully awake. The question of where she was going was the specific weight, not whether she was going. He had raised the University of Alaska again in early May, at dinner on a Tuesday, in what he hoped was a tone that sounded like casual inquiry rather than the sustained campaign it actually was. The University of Alaska had been Carlisle Cullen's suggestion, which Charlie found both useful and irritating in equal measure. Useful because it represented an actual institution at an actual distance that implied an actual future with actual independence, and irritating because Carlisle Cullen, suggesting it meant it fit into whatever plan the Cullen family had for after graduation, and Charlie was not confident that plan looked the way the University of Alaska implied it looked. Bella had responded to the University of Alaska question the way she responded to most direct inquiries about her post-graduation plans, which was with a pleasantness that was slightly too even to be entirely genuine, and a collection of non-committal statements about still thinking things through and wanting to make sure she made the right decision. Charlie had listened to these statements and counted how many times he had heard versions of them over the preceding months, and arrived at a number that told him they were not going to produce a different result on this particular Tuesday than they had on any of the preceding occasions. He let it go that evening. He let it go the way he let go of things he intended to return to, setting it down carefully rather than releasing it. The week before graduation, Alice Cullen appeared at the house on a Saturday morning to discuss, of all things, a party. Charlie opened the door to find her on the porch, unsmall and bright-eyed and carrying the particular energy of someone who had already decided everything and was now extending the courtesy of informing the relevant parties. He had encountered Alice Cullen on a handful of occasions and found her, each time, simultaneously charming and slightly overwhelming, like standing near something that generated its own weather. She wanted to throw a graduation party for Bella at the Cullen house. That evening, after the ceremony, she wanted Charlie to come. She said this last part with a directness that managed to sound like an invitation while carrying the structural weight of an expectation. And Charlie, who was professionally trained to notice the difference between those two things, noted it. He said he would think about it. He thought about it for approximately 40 minutes and then called Bella at the Cullen house, where she was spending the morning, and said he would come to the party if she wanted him there. And she said yes, she wanted him there, with a genuine warmth that decided the matter. Graduation morning arrived grey and cool in the way that most mornings arrived in Forks. The sky a uniform white that diffused the light evenly and without drama. Charlie had pressed his good shirt the night before and found his camera in the drawer where it had been since Christmas, and checked the battery and put in a fresh one and set it by the door. He made breakfast for both of them, and Bella came downstairs in her graduation gown over jeans, her cap slightly crooked, and he straightened it for her without being asked, and she let him without comment. And that small moment of domestic normalcy felt so complete and so fragile that he had to look away from it before it became something he couldn't manage at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning. "You look good," he said, which was inadequate and accurate. She smiled at him across the table with a smile that had something retrospective in it, something that was looking back even while the moment was still present, and he thought that she was feeling the weight of this day in her own way, carrying her own version of the complicated feeling of standing at an ending that was also a beginning. And he did not ask her about it because some feelings were better honored by silence than by question. The gymnasium had been arranged with the particular effortful formality of high school ceremonies everywhere, folding chairs in rows, A temporary stage at one end, streamers in the school colours that someone had attached to everything that would accept being attached to. Parents filled the back 2/3 of the space with cameras and programs, and the slightly damp warmth of too many people in a room that was designed for a different purpose. Charlie found a seat near the aisle where he could see the stage clearly, and settled in with his camera and looked around at the faces he knew, nodding to the ones that caught his eye, exchanging the quiet acknowledgements of a community marking a shared occasion. The Cullen family arrived together and sat in a row near the front, which put them partly in Charlie's sightline throughout the ceremony. He found himself observing them with the same divided attention he had been giving them for months, and the part of him that was watching the ceremony and the part that was watching the family that was positioned increasingly at the center of his daughter's life. Carlisle Cullen sat with the relaxed attention of someone accustomed to being in public spaces without drawing notice, which struck Charlie as slightly at odds with the fact that he invariably drew notice, being the kind of person whose appearance made people look twice without being able to articulate why. Esme sat beside him, and Charlie had observed Esme Cullen enough times at this point to have developed a specific and somewhat unwilling regard for her. She had a quality of genuine warmth that was difficult to dismiss, a maternal attentiveness that expressed itself in small, consistent ways that Charlie recognized as real rather than performed. He had seen enough performed warmth in his professional life to know the difference. Rosalie and Emmett sat at one end of the row, Alice and Jasper at the other, and Edward in the middle, which placed him clearly in Charlie's peripheral vision for the duration of the ceremony, a fact Charlie was aware of and could do nothing about. The names were called in alphabetical order, which placed Bella toward the beginning. Charlie had his camera ready and his attention fully forward when they called Isabella Swan, and he watched his daughter walk across that stage with the careful navigation of someone who was aware of the potential for tripping and was allocating considerable concentration to the prevention of it, which was so entirely Bella that it made something in his chest pull tight in a way that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with love in its most uncomplicated form. He took 4 photographs in rapid succession and suspected at least 2 of them were blurry from the slight shake in his hands that he had not anticipated and could not fully account for. She found him in the crowd afterward, moving against the flow of graduates and families converging in the middle of the gymnasium floor, and he met her halfway and hugged her with the unguarded completeness that he usually reserved for private moments, one arm around her shoulders and one hand at the back of her head, the way he had held her when she was small and the world was simpler, and the things he needed to protect her from were the ordinary, manageable things that fathers were equipped to address. "Congratulations, kid," he said against her hair. "Thanks, Dad," she said, and held on for a moment before the crowd necessitated separating. He took more photographs. He took photographs with Bella and with her friends, with Jessica Stanley and Angela Weber and a few others who had been constants in her folk social life. And he accepted the congratulations of other parents with the warmth of a man who was genuinely proud and genuinely sad in equal proportion, and was doing a reasonable job of leading with the former. At the Cullen party that evening was unlike anything Charlie had encountered in Forks before, which was saying something given that Forks did not have a broad range of social registers to choose from. The house itself was enough to establish that clearly. All glass and pale wood, and the kind of architectural confidence that came from both significant resources and genuine taste. Alice had apparently been planning the decorations for longer than the occasion warranted, which resulted in something that was elegant rather than excessive despite the obvious effort. And Charlie, who had attended exactly the kind of parties his job and his income had qualified him for across the years, recognized the difference between money spent and care taken, and understood that what he was looking at was primarily the latter. Esme met him at the door. He had prepared himself for a degree of social difficulty, for the managed politeness of an evening spent in a house he was not entirely comfortable in, surrounded by people whose relationship to his daughter he was not entirely comfortable with. What he had not prepared for was Esme Cullen taking his jacket and asking him about whether he preferred coffee or something cold, and remembering somehow that he had mentioned to Bella once that he liked his coffee without sugar, and producing a cup in approximately 4 minutes that was correct in every particular. It was a small thing. It was also the kind of small thing that was not small, the kind of attentiveness that people either had or didn't have. And Charlie, who had spent 20 years noticing whether people actually heard what he said or were simply waiting for their turn to speak, and noticed it and filed it and allowed it to adjust slightly the temperature of the evening. He spoke with Carlyle near the bookshelves that lined one wall of the main room, a conversation that ranged from the professional to the personal in a way that felt natural rather than navigated. Carlyle asked about the county, about the work, about whether Charlie found Forks an interesting place to police, or whether its smallness made it feel constrained. He asked good questions, the kind that suggested genuine curiosity rather than social obligation, and listened to the answers in the complete way that Charlie had first noticed in Edward and now recognized as a family characteristic, the particular quality of attention that the Cullens brought to conversations that made the conversations feel like they mattered. And Charlie asked about the University of Alaska. He asked it directly because he was not a man who approached direct questions indirectly when the direct route was available, and because he wanted to see how Carlyle responded to being asked about something that touched on the family's plans for his daughter. Carlyle met his eyes and said it was an excellent institution, that he had mentioned it to Bella as a genuine option, and that he hoped Bella would give it serious consideration as part of whatever she ultimately decided. He said the last part with a steadiness that was not evasive, but which Charlie noticed contained no personal endorsement of any particular outcome, which was itself a kind of answer. "What do you think she's going to decide?" Charlie asked. Carlyle was quiet for a moment, not the evasive quiet of someone buying time, but the considered quiet of someone choosing honesty carefully. "I think Bella is going to make the decision that she believes is right for her," he said. "I think she's thought about it more carefully than most people her age think about most things. And I think whatever she decides, she'll have reasons that are genuinely hers." It was not a reassuring answer. It was also, Charlie thought, probably an honest one. He found Bella near the end of the evening standing with Edward on the far side of the room, not talking, just standing close together in the way they sometimes were, the way that was not about performance or demonstration, but about proximity itself, as though standing near each other was something they did as naturally as breathing. Charlie watched them from across the room for a moment, the length of time that was observation rather than surveillance, and felt the complicated mixture of things he always felt when he watched them together. He stayed until 10:30, which was longer than he had planned, and which surprised him when he looked at his watch. Esme brought him his jacket and thanked him for coming with a warmth that was so entirely genuine that he thanked her back with equivalent sincerity and meant it. In the car, driving home through the dark, familiar streets of Forks, Charlie sat with the evening, the ceremony and the photographs and the hug on the gymnasium floor, Esme's coffee made correctly without being asked, Carlisle's honest non-answer, Bella standing close to Edward in the way of people who have already decided. But the porch light was on when he pulled into the driveway, which meant Bella had not yet come home. He went inside and left it on, and made himself a cup of tea he didn't particularly want, and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house and let the evening settle around him. She had graduated. His daughter had graduated. Whatever came next, whatever decisions were already made and waiting to be announced, that part was done and real and his. The photographs in the camera by the door, the memory of her walking across the stage, the hug that had lasted slightly longer than usual. He finished his tea. He rinsed the cup. He checked the locks. He left the porch light on and went to bed and lay in the dark and waited for the sound of the front door that would tell him she was home. The fishing trips had been a constant for longer than Charlie could accurately reconstruct, which was itself one of the things he valued most about them. They predated Bella's arrival in Forks. They predated most of the complications that had accumulated in his life over the past year and the year before that. They belonged to a simpler stratum of his existence, one that had not been disturbed by the particular upheavals of the past 18 months. And stepping into them was something like stepping into a room that had been kept at the same temperature regardless of what was happening in the rest of the house. He needed that constancy more than he usually admitted, and the fishing trips provided it without requiring him to ask. Billy Black had been his closest friend for nearly 15 years. Not his only friend, but the specific kind of friend that occupied a position nothing else quite filled. The person you called not always because you knew what you needed to say, but because you knew the saying of something to this particular person would help you understand what you had been trying to say. Charlie had not had many people like that across his life. He had had his work, which was sustaining in the way that purposeful labor was sustaining, and he had had the warm social texture of a small town where everyone knew his name and his history, which was comfortable without being deep. But Billy was the deeper thing, the friendship that had its own private language and its own way of holding silences that didn't require filling. And Charlie had come to rely on it in ways he would have found difficult to articulate, but which he felt clearly every time he pulled into Billy's driveway on a Saturday morning with the tackle boxes in the truck bed. The trips had taken on a different quality since the previous autumn, not in their logistics, which remained unchanged. Same spots on the river, same battered equipment, same thermos of coffee that was never quite hot enough by the time either of them got around to drinking it. What had shifted was the atmosphere of the conversations that happened around the fishing, the texture and weight of what was said and what was deliberately not said, the way both men had grown more careful with each other in precise proportion to how much more there was that neither could fully address. Charlie was conscious of this. He suspected Billy was equally conscious of it. They had not discussed being conscious of it, which was itself one of the forms the carefulness took. The trip in early June came on a Saturday, the week after graduation, when the weather had made one of its occasional tentative gestures toward improvement, and the river was running at a level that suggested reasonable prospects. Charlie picked Billy up at the usual time, and they drove out through the familiar roads with the radio on low and the windows cracked and the easy silence of people who had been making this drive long enough that it required no conversation to feel complete. They set up on the bank at the spot they had used for years, the slight bend where the current slowed and the bank widened enough for Billy's chair to sit level without adjustment. Charlie cast first and stepped back to give Billy room, and for a while there was nothing but the river and the trees and the distant call of something he could never identify, no matter how many times he heard it coming from that direction. "How's Bella settling after graduation?" Billy asked eventually, his eyes on the water, his tone the easy register of ordinary Saturday morning conversation. "Hard to say," Charlie said. "She seems okay on the surface. She went to the Cullens the morning after and was home for dinner, which I'm choosing to read as a good sign, even if I'm aware that interpretation has some optimism built into it." Billy made a sound that acknowledged the statement without fully endorsing the interpretation. "Any decisions about what comes next? College plans?" "Nothing she's sharing with me," Charlie said, which I keep telling myself means nothing's been decided, even though I know that's probably not accurate. "She'll tell you when she's ready," Billy said. "That's the best you can usually expect from someone who's made up their mind, but isn't ready to have the conversation about it yet." Charlie looked at him. "You sound like you're speaking from experience." "I have a son," Billy said simply, which was sufficient. They fished in silence for a while. A heron landed on a rock at the far bend and stood with the absolute stillness of its kind. And Charlie watched it and found himself thinking about stillness and what it cost to maintain it, and whether stillness that looked like peace ever actually was, or whether it was always just the disciplined surface of something more complicated underneath. And he'd been thinking about this more than usual lately, in the context of a young man who sat on his couch on Wednesday evenings and whose quality of control stillness had been occupying a corner of Charlie's mind since January. "Billy," he said, and something in the register of his voice made Billy turn to look at him in the way he didn't always turn when Charlie spoke. "I want to ask you something directly, and I'd like you to try to answer it as directly as you can, even if the direct answer is that you can't tell me." Billy said nothing, which was his own kind of yes. "What are Jacob and those boys doing over there?" Charlie said. "On the reservation, in the woods, wherever it is they go, when they go. I've been watching it for months. I can see the shape of it from the outside, the organization of it, and the way they carry themselves like men with a specific purpose. I'm not asking out of suspicion. I'm asking because they're young, and I've been watching them carry something serious, and I'd like to understand what I'm watching, even partially." Billy was quiet for longer than most of his pauses. He looked at the water with the expression of a man carefully selecting from among several possible answers, choosing the one that was both honest and contained within whatever limits he was operating under. "They're protecting the community," he said, "the reservation and the surrounding area. That's the most accurate thing I can tell you." "Protecting it from what?" from things that come in from outside, Billy said. Things that don't respect boundaries and that aren't safe to leave unaddressed. Charlie absorbed this. Is it connected to what's been happening in Seattle? The incidents I've been tracking? The pause this time was longer still. Not the same thing, Billy said, but the same kind of territory, the same general category of problem. Charlie turned this phrase over carefully. The same kind of territory. He thought about Patterson's face at the Olympia meeting, saying unprecedented and meaning it in the fullest possible sense. He thought about the forest on the northern roads going quiet in that particular waiting way, and the livestock reports and the map on his wall, and all the pieces he had been accumulating for months without having the framework to assemble them. Are they safe? He asked. The boys. Yes, Billy said, and this answer came immediately, without the careful weighing of the others, which told Charlie something about the quality of the certainty behind it. They know what they're doing. They've been prepared for it. They're not operating without knowledge or without support. How long has this been going on? Long enough that they're practiced at it, Billy said. Not so long that they've become complacent. He paused. Jacob specifically is very good at what he does, Charlie. Better than I would have predicted, and I had high expectations. Charlie thought about Jacob on his porch, asking if Bella was going to be okay with the careful composure of someone carrying a weight they had decided not to put down. He thought about Billy saying, not just a kid, not anymore, in the tone of a father who was proud and grieved in equal measure. Does he talk to you about it? Charlie asked. About the Bella situation, about how he's doing with all of it. Billy's expression shifted into something recognizably paternal, something that Charlie felt directly in the way you felt things that were the same species as your own experience. Some, he said. He processes privately and presents as fine. Always has been that way, even before all of this. He paused, and something moved through his expression that might have been amusement under other circumstances. Does that remind you of anyone? Charlie almost smiled despite himself. Somewhat. They have more in common than either of them would probably appreciate being told, Billy said. The stubbornness, the loyalty that goes further than is strictly advisable, the way they love people quietly and then are surprised when the love makes them vulnerable. He shook his head slightly. Your Jacob is going to be okay. That's what I want you to know about him. He's in pain right now, real pain. And he's managing it the way he manages everything, which is by converting it into forward motion. But he's going to be okay. You sound certain about that, Charlie said. I am certain about that, Billy said. Some things a father knows about his child that aren't based on evidence so much as on 30 years of watching who that child is at their center, even when the surface of things is hard to read. Jacob at his center is someone who comes through things. I've always known that about him. Charlie was quiet, sitting with this, and with his own version of the same knowledge about his own child. The things he knew about Bella that weren't evidence-based, but were true nonetheless, and that she was braver than she gave herself credit for. That her stubbornness, which drove him to the edge of his patience on a regular basis, was also the quality that had gotten her through the worst months of the previous year. That she loved fiercely and permanently and in ways that were going to cost her, and that she had made her peace with that cost in a way that Charlie was still working toward making his peace with. The heron lifted from its rock with the long, unhurried wing beats of a creature that had nowhere urgent to be, and both men watched it clear the bend and disappear downstream, and the river ran on in its own unconcerned way. "I worry about both of them," Charlie said, after the heron was gone. "All the time. I'll wake up at 3 in the morning and lie there cataloguing the things I can't fix. And the list has gotten considerably longer over the past year." "I know that feeling," Billy said. "How do you manage it?" Billy considered this with genuine care, the way he considered things he had thought about seriously, rather than things he was working out for the first time. "I try to hold worry and faith simultaneously rather than letting one displace the other," he said. "The worry keeps you paying attention. The faith keeps you functional. If you only have the worry, you stop sleeping and start making decisions out of fear, which are usually the wrong decisions. If you only have the faith, you stop paying attention, which is its own kind of failure." He paused. "The balance is hard. I won't pretend it isn't. But I try to lead with the faith when I have a choice about which one goes first." Charlie looked at his line in the water and thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. He had not, he acknowledged to himself, been leading with faith lately. He had been leading with its less useful relative, which was anticipatory dread, the dread of outcomes not yet arrived. And it had been sitting on him like weather for weeks in a way that was not producing anything useful. He could not fix what he couldn't see. He could not protect his daughter from worlds he didn't have the vocabulary for. What he could do was be present, be the consistent thing, be the person she could come back to without conditions. The cloud cover thickened toward early afternoon, and the wind came off the water with enough cold in it to make continuing unpleasant, without yielding enough fish to justify the discomfort. And they packed up with the efficient practicality of men who had done this enough times to know when a session had given what it was going to give. The drive back was quiet in the comfortable way. The radio played something neither of them was listening to. The roads were wet from an earlier drizzle that had come and gone without announcement, which was typical. Pulling into Billy's driveway, Charlie turned off the engine, but didn't immediately move to get out. And Billy, who understood the grammar of these moments, also stayed still. "Charlie," Billy said, and in the tone that meant he had been holding something for the right moment and had determined this was it. "The things that are in motion right now, the things neither of us can talk about with full honesty, they are going to resolve. I want you to have that. I can't give you details, but I can give you that the people we care about are going to come through this. And I believe that with the same certainty I just described about Jacob." Charlie looked at him. "Both of them? Bella too?" Billy met his eyes steadily. "Both of them." Charlie sat with this for a long moment. It was not evidence. It was not a guarantee in any form that would satisfy the professional part of his mind that dealt in evidence and verification. But it was Billy, who had never said things he didn't mean, and had never offered reassurance as a social performance, and that counted for something that was different from evidence and not lesser than it. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in the full weight of those two words. He drove home through the late afternoon grey, the light flat and even through the clouds, and thought about faith as the thing that kept you functional and worry as the thing that kept you paying attention, and the balance between them that Billy made sound more achievable than Charlie had been finding it. He thought about the river and the heron, and the long patience of things that simply waited without spending the waiting into stress. He pulled into his driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. Bella's truck was gone. He had the house to himself, which happened less often than it used to, and which he now noticed in a way he hadn't before she'd come to live with him, in the particular quality of a space that was structured around another person's presence and felt their absence clearly. He went inside and made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard and the tree line in the fading afternoon light, and thought about two men on a riverbank and the vast careful space between what they could say and what they both understood, and how much meaning lived in that space, and how much of what mattered most between people existed in exactly that register, the things carried together without being named, the knowledge held in common without being spoken. He drank his coffee. He thought about Jacob coming through things. He thought about Bella at the center of herself, the brave, stubborn, faithful center that he knew the way he knew it, not from evidence, but from years of watching. The sky darkened. He turned on the porch light earlier than he needed to, the way he had been doing for weeks. And then he made dinner and set a plate aside for Bella and sat down at the table alone and ate in the quiet company of a house that was still standing, still warm, still the place his daughter came home to at the end of her days in whatever world she was inhabiting that he couldn't follow her into. When her truck turned into the driveway later that evening, he felt the loosening in his chest that he felt every time, the specific physical relief of her return. And he called out that there was dinner in the oven, and she called back thanks. And the house became itself again, in the way it only fully became itself when she was in it. He washed the dishes. He thought about faith as the more useful thing. He tried, deliberately, to lead with it. It was harder than Billy made it sound, but it was possible, he was finding, if you chose it specifically rather than waiting for it to arrive on its own. Faith was not a feeling he was coming to understand. It was a practice, like stillness, like patience, like leaving the porch light on for someone whose road home you couldn't see from where you were standing. He went to bed. The rain came back against the windows, steady and unhurried, the sound of forks at night that he had fallen asleep to for 20 years, and that was, despite everything, still one of the most familiar and settling sounds he knew. He closed his eyes and led with the faith, and let the worry do its quieter work underneath. And somewhere in the balance between them, eventually, he slept, and it had been building for weeks in the way that most significant things built in Charlie's experience, not dramatically, but through the patient accumulation of small pressures, each one individually manageable, collectively producing something that eventually required release. He was aware of the building. He had been aware of it the way he was aware of weather patterns, tracking the signs without being able to determine the exact moment the system would arrive, or precisely what form it would take when it did. The immediate cause was a Thursday evening in mid-June, which was ordinary in every external particular. Bella had come home from the Cullen house at 6:45, within the terms of the curfew, but only just, which was a pattern that had been consistent enough to constitute its own kind of statement. And Charlie had dinner ready, because making dinner was one of the things he could do, one of the domains where his competence was not in question, and because the ritual of it, the simple, reliable act of having food on the table at a reasonable hour, was something he held onto in stretches when other things felt less within his control. Bella came in, said it smelled good, washed her hands, sat down. These were the right moves, performed with a naturalness that was genuine rather than strategic. She was not a calculating person in the manipulative sense. Charlie had never believed that about her. She was simply someone who had oriented herself towards something with complete commitment and was managing the peripheral relationships of her life, including the one with her father, as thoughtfully as she could, while keeping her primary orientation intact. He understood this. He even respected it, in the abstract. In the concrete, sitting across from her at the kitchen table while she talked about her day in the slightly too even tone of someone whose actual day was located elsewhere. It was harder to find the respect and easier to feel the distance. He had asked about Jacob 3 times that week already. Tuesday at breakfast, briefly and without pressure. Wednesday evening, more pointedly. Thursday morning before she left for the day, with enough directness that she could not have mistaken it for casual inquiry. She'd responded to all 3 with variations on the same deflection, that she would reach out soon, that things were complicated, that she was managing the friendship in the way that made sense given everything. Given everything. It was the phrase she used most often, when she meant the things she wasn't going to explain further, and Charlie had come to understand it as a door closing rather than an acknowledgement opening. He waited until they were both most of the way through dinner before he said anything, because he had learned, through the accumulated experience of 18 months of parenting a daughter he had not raised from infancy and was still learning to calibrate himself to, that conversations like this one went slightly better on a full stomach than an empty one, and slightly better when both parties had been sitting together long enough for the atmosphere to be one of shared domesticity rather than immediate confrontation. I want to talk about Jacob, he said. He kept his voice level. He had prepared for this in the way he prepared for difficult conversations at work, which was to decide in advance what he needed to say and in what order, so that the emotion of the moment didn't reorganize his points in ways that were less effective. Bella set down her fork. Dad, I'm not asking you to do something unreasonable, Charlie said. I'm asking you to maintain a friendship with a person who has been genuinely important to you and who doesn't deserve to be set aside because it's inconvenient right now. It's not about inconvenience, Bella said, and her voice had the careful quality of someone who had also been preparing for this conversation, which told him it had been as present in her mind as in his. Then what is it about? She was quiet for a moment. It's about the fact that seeing Jacob makes things harder for him, not easier. Every time I go over there, every time we spend time together, it makes it more difficult for him to move forward. I'm not staying away to be cruel. I'm staying away because I think it's kinder. Charlie looked at her across the table. It was a more considered answer than he had expected, and he gave it the consideration it deserved, turning it over and examining it honestly. Does Jacob think that? He asked. Has he told you that? He doesn't have to tell me, Bella said. I can see it. You can see it, Charlie repeated. But you can't hear it from him because you're not talking to him. He paused. That circular reasoning, Belle. You're making a decision about what's best for him based on observations you can only make if you're in contact with him, while using that decision to justify not being in contact with him. Something shifted in her expression. He could see her engaging with the logic of it, which was different from agreeing with it. "It's more complicated than that," she said. "It's always more complicated than that," Charlie said, and he heard the edge coming into his voice and made a deliberate effort to keep it from sharpening further. "I know that. I know your situation is complicated, Bella. I've been watching it be complicated for the better part of a year, and I haven't pushed you as hard as I could have pushed you, because I've been trying to respect the fact that you're 18 and capable of making your own choices. But Jacob Black is not an abstraction in this. He is a real person who cares about you and who keeps showing up even when showing up costs him something. And the least you owe him is not to make decisions about his well-being on his behalf without asking him." Bella's jaw tightened, in the way it tightened when she was holding something back that wanted to come out. "You think I don't know what I owe him? I think you're avoiding a conversation that's going to be painful," Charlie said. "Which I understand. I've avoided painful conversations in my life. But avoidance is a choice too, and it has costs for the person on the other end of it that you don't always see because you're not there to see them." "That's not fair," Bella said, and now there was real feeling in her voice, the careful control loosening slightly at the edges. "Maybe not," Charlie said, "but it's true, and you know it's true, which is why you're angry about it." She pushed back from the table and stood up, not dramatically, not in the way of someone performing anger, but in the way of someone who needed to not be sitting down for a moment. She went to the sink and stood there with her back to him, and Charlie sat at the table and let her have the moment, understanding that this was not a capitulation or a deflection, but simply the need for a few seconds of not being looked at, while she organized what she felt about what had just been said. When she turned back around, her expression was different. The tightness had eased somewhat, and what was underneath it was not what Charlie had expected, which was more defensiveness or more anger. It was something closer to grief. Tired, honest, unperformed grief. "I don't know how to be fair to everyone at the same time," she said. "I don't know how to be what Jacob needs me to be, and what Edward needs me to be, and what you need me to be, all at once. I keep trying to figure out how to do it, and I keep coming up short. And staying away from Jacob is the one thing I can do that feels like it at least isn't making the situation actively worse for him." Charlie looked at his daughter standing at his kitchen sink and felt the anger drain out of him in the way it drained when you understood that the person you were angry at was not acting from selfishness, but from a species of exhaustion that deserved something other than further pressure. He was still right about Jacob. He believed he was right about Jacob, but being right and being the right person to push on a given evening were not always the same thing. "Sit down," he said, more gently. She came back to the table and sat down, and they looked at each other across the remains of dinner in the honest way they could sometimes look at each other when the performances on both sides were down. "I hear you," Charlie said. "I understand that you're trying. I know it's not easy, what you're navigating." He paused. "But I want you to go to La Push this week. Not for me. Because Jacob deserves to hear from you directly. Not to be managed from a distance by someone who has decided what's best for him without consulting him. Go see him. Have the hard conversation. Let him tell you what he needs." Bella was quiet for a long time, long enough that Charlie began to wonder if this was another version of the same careful, not quite agreement he had been receiving for weeks. Then she said, "Okay, this week," he confirmed. She picked up her fork again and ate the last of her dinner in the quiet that followed, and Charlie did the same. And the atmosphere between them was not comfortable exactly, but was honest in a way that was more valuable than comfort. After dinner, Bella helped clear the table without being asked, and then went upstairs, and Charlie stood at the sink washing the dishes in the quiet of the kitchen, and turned the conversation over in his mind the way he turned over everything, looking for what he had done well and what he had done poorly, and what he would do differently if the same moment came again. He had come in harder than he intended early on. He had backed off at the right time, or close enough to it. He had said the thing about Jacob that needed to be said, and she had heard it, which was not the same as agreeing with it, but was necessary for agreeing with it to become possible. He called Billy. He did this not to report anything, not to coordinate, but because it was the evening after the kind of conversation that left residue, and he needed to put the residue somewhere before he went to sleep with it. Billy answered on the second ring, and Charlie could hear the television in the background, something with a live audience. She agreed to go see him, Charlie said, without building up to it. Billy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This week." She said, "This week." A pause that contained several things, one of which was relief. "That's good, Charlie. That's genuinely good. You'll be around if she comes by." "I'll make sure of it," Billy said, with the quiet efficiency of a father who understood his role in this and was prepared to play it without being asked to do so explicitly. "And Charlie, what you did tonight, pushing her on this, that mattered. She needed to hear it from you." "I came in too hard at first," Charlie said. "Maybe," Billy said, "but you landed where you needed to land. That's what counts." Charlie set the last of the dishes in the rack and dried his hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle and stood in the quiet kitchen. Is he going to be okay when she comes? If she comes and she's still oriented the way she's oriented, toward Edward, toward that family, why is seeing her going to make things worse for him? Billy was quiet for a long moment, the careful, weighing kind of quiet. "He needs the conversation more than he needs the protection from it," he said finally. "Jacob has been carrying an uncertainty that's harder than a difficult truth would be. Whatever she says to him, even if it's not what he wants to hear, it's better than the not knowing. He can work with the truth. He's been struggling to work with the silence." Charlie absorbed this. He thought about the difference between a painful truth and a prolonged uncertainty, and which of them was actually kinder to live with, and recognized in Billy's answer something that applied to more than Jacob, that applied in fact to Charlie himself, and his own long practice of holding questions he hadn't pushed hard enough to have answered. He said goodnight to Billy and put the phone down and went to check the locks, the front door and the back door and the kitchen window that was still slightly loose after 4 months of meaning to fix it. He told himself, standing at the kitchen window with his hand on the latch, that he was going to fix the window this weekend. It was a small thing and a specific thing, and it was within his power to do, which made it, on an evening like this one, feel particularly valuable. He turned on the porch light. He went upstairs past Bella's door, which was closed but with the light on underneath it, which meant she was awake and probably not doing anything as straightforward as sleeping. He paused outside her door for a moment, his hand almost raised to knock, and then decided against it. He had said what he had to say. On the rest was hers to sit with in her own time and her own way, the same right to private processing that he had been asking her to extend to Jacob. He went to his room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor for a while, the way he did at the end of difficult days, not thinking about anything specific, but letting everything settle to the level where it could be set down temporarily without losing its place. He thought about Bella's face when she said, "I don't know how to be fair to everyone at the same time." He thought about how young she was, not in the dismissive way that people use the youth of young people to invalidate them, but in the real and tender way of a father who could see his child carrying something too large for her years with more grace than most adults would manage. And he was angry with her about Jacob, and he was proud of her in the same breath, and both things were entirely true, which was the condition of parenting he had come to understand. The simultaneous residence of contradictory feelings that did not cancel each other out, but coexisted in the same space with a steadiness that surprised him sometimes. He lay down. The rain came back at the windows, the familiar sound, and outside the porch light threw its small, reliable circle of yellow onto the wet, dark driveway and the street beyond. He thought about Billy saying she needed to hear it from you. He thought about the dishes drying in the rack and the window latch he was going to fix this weekend, and the ordinary persistence of domestic life through everything that made domestic life feel insufficient to the moment. Yet he thought about his daughter's closed door with the light on underneath it, the light that meant she was awake and thinking and alive and in the house. All three of those last things, awake and thinking and alive and in the house. On the worst nights, when the weight was at its heaviest, those were the things he came back to. He closed his eyes. The rain continued. He was asleep before he expected to be, which was how sleep worked on the nights when the thing that needed to be done had been done, imperfectly but sufficiently, and could be set down for at least a few hours before the morning required picking it back up again. The summer settled over Forks with his usual reluctance, the light improving incrementally rather than arriving with any conviction, the temperature climbing by degrees so modest that the change was more statistical than experiential. Charlie had lived here long enough that he no longer compared Fork summers to summers elsewhere, which was a form of acceptance that had taken several years to arrive at, and which he considered, on reflection, a healthy adaptation rather than a concession. The town was what it was. The weather was what it was. He had made his peace with both of those facts long before the current complications had arrived to occupy his attention, and the peace held even now, which was something. What the summer did not do in the weeks following graduation was settle in the way that the season's arrival usually settled things. There was a quality to those weeks that Charlie felt persistently, but could not persistently locate, the particular atmospheric pressure of a situation that was continuing to develop beneath the surface of days that looked, from the outside, like nothing especially significant was happening. He had felt this quality in investigations before, in cases that were building towards something while the visible evidence remained insufficient to tell you what. He had learned across 20 years to trust that feeling even when he couldn't justify it in terms that would survive professional scrutiny. He was trusting it now, and it was costing him sleep in small but accumulating increments that he was beginning to notice in the mornings. The animal disturbance reports continued coming in through June and into early July. He had started a separate file for them, a paper file rather than a digital entry, which was a habit he maintained for things he was tracking informally and did not want appearing in official systems before he understood what he was looking at. The file had grown steadily over the preceding weeks. It contained notes from 3 separate farmers in the northern part of the county, each reporting variations on the same pattern. Spooked livestock, fences disturbed in ways that suggested something had come up against them from the outside, animals refusing to enter pasture, areas they had used without incident for years. One farmer, a man named Hess, who had been running cattle on the same land for 22 years, and whose observations Charlie gave significant weight to for precisely that reason, undescribed his herd clustering at the southern end of the north pasture every night for 2 weeks and refusing to approach the fence line regardless of where the grazing was. He said they smelled something. He said animals knew things before people did, and he had learned over 2 decades of farming to pay attention when they were trying to tell him something. Charlie paid attention. The file also contained notes from Jeff, the wildlife officer, about displaced ground nesting across a wider area than any single predator or pack could account for, and about track patterns at the forest edge that were inconsistent with known regional species in terms of both size and distribution. Jeff had sent the measurements to a colleague at the university's zoology department and received back an assessment that was, in Jeff's word, when he called Charlie about it, baffling. The colleague had looked at the data and suggested either measurement error or a species not currently documented in the Pacific Northwest, which were the 2 explanations available when the data didn't fit the existing catalogue, and which were both, in their different ways, unsatisfying. And Charlie added this to the file and thought about what it meant to have data that didn't fit the existing catalogue, and about how much of his recent experience fell into exactly that description. He drove the northern roads 3 times a week now, occasionally more. He had stopped pretending to himself that this was general due diligence and had acknowledged it privately and without particular drama as something more directed. He was watching for something. He did not have a precise description of what he was watching for, which was uncomfortable for a man whose professional practice was built on the precise description of things. But the discomfort had become familiar enough that he had mostly stopped fighting it and had started simply carrying it alongside everything else he was carrying. On a Tuesday evening in the last week of June, he saw something. He had pulled over at the wide point above the Garrett farm, the same spot he had stopped at on previous drives, the place where the road rose slightly and the lower pasture was visible below in the dark, a pale, irregular shape against the darker mass of the forest beyond. He had turned off his lights and his engine and been sitting for approximately 10 minutes in the complete rural dark, long enough for his eyes to adjust fully and for the residual sounds of driving to dissipate from his awareness when he became conscious of movement at the far tree line. It was not the movement of deer. He knew deer movement well, had spent enough hours in the field across enough seasons to have the specific vocabulary of it in his body rather than just his mind. This was categorically different, and it was fast in a way that deer were not fast in open ground at night. Deer being creatures that moved quickly in bursts, separated by intervals of assessment. This was continuous, ground-covering, purposeful movement that did not pause and did not assess, because whatever was moving did not appear to require pausing or assessing. It was also low in a way that was difficult to reconcile with the speed, close to the ground, but not in the crouching way of a stalking predator, more in the way of something built differently than the things he had references for. It crossed the lower pasture in less time than seemed consistent with what he was seeing. He reached for the spotlight on the cruiser door and had it on and sweeping toward the far tree line within seconds. And the beam, which was a good one, powerful and wide, had showed him the edge of the forest and the still wet grass and the dark line of undergrowth at the tree base and nothing else. Not the nothing of a space that had been empty for a while. The specific, fresh nothing of a space that something had just vacated. He held the beam on the tree line for a full minute. Nothing moved. No eyes caught the light in the way that animal eyes caught light. No branches moved in the way they moved when something large had recently pushed through them. The forest showed him nothing and told him nothing, and sat in the beam of his spotlight with the composed unhelpfulness of a witness who has decided not to cooperate. He drove home and made notes in his paper file, precise and detailed notes of the kind he made at scenes, and time and location and description of what he had observed with as much exactness as the language available to him would accommodate. He sat at the kitchen table and wrote until the notes were complete, and then sat for a while longer in the quiet of the house before going to bed. He did not sleep quickly. In the morning, he drove back to the lower pasture before his shift started and walked the ground in the early grey light with the systematic attention he brought to scenes he was trying to read. The grass was disturbed in a pattern consistent with passage, the bent stems beginning to recover but not yet fully upright, which told him the crossing had occurred within the past several hours and confirmed that what he had seen the previous evening had been real and not a function of tired eyes and low light playing together in unproductive ways. He found no tracks. This was the thing that stopped him standing in the middle of Hess's lower pasture with the damp of the morning coming through his boots and the grey sky pressing down evenly overhead. The ground was soft, the way Pacific Northwest summer ground was soft even in the dry season, and things that crossed it left impressions. He had found the impressions of deer earlier in the same field, clear and unambiguous, the pointed oval of a hoof in soft ground. He had found the impressions of what was probably a coyote near the eastern fence line, the rounded pad and toe pattern, unmistakable. In what he had not found, along the line of disturbed grass that traced the crossing he had watched the night before, was anything that constituted a track in the conventional sense. He stood there for a long time and thought about what that meant and could not arrive at a satisfying conclusion. He put the notes in his file and went to work and went about his day with the professional competence that 20 years of practice had made largely automatic, which meant his mind was free to continue working the problem underneath the surface activity of the shift without requiring him to stop doing his job. By end of day, he had not arrived at a better conclusion, but he had arrived at the decision to start talking to people more directly, which was progress of a kind. Dwyer brought him a report the following week. I had standing in his office doorway with a slightly pained expression of someone about to say something in a professional context that they are not confident will be received professionally, Residents on Bogachiel Road, Dwyer said. I've got 3 separate households reporting nighttime sounds over the past 2 weeks. Not sounds they can identify. Not sounds they've heard before, according to all 3 of them. Describe the sounds, Charlie said. Dwyer consulted his notes. Movement. Large, fast movement through the forest. One resident said it sounded like something very big moving at a speed that didn't match its size. He paused. Mrs. Carmichael, on the north end of the road, said, and I'm quoting her directly here, that whatever was out there was moving through the trees the way a bird moved through air. She said it didn't seem to be impeded by the forest the way things usually were. Charlie looked at him steadily. Any visual confirmation? 2 residents reported seeing movement through the tree line. General impressions, nothing specific enough to identify. Both described it as fast and low and larger than a person. Another pause, the pained expression deepening slightly. One of them specifically said it was too fast for what it looked like. Charlie took the addresses and thanked Dwyer and told him to log the reports formally and take them seriously, which visibly relieved Dwyer, who had clearly been uncertain about whether he was about to be told he was wasting departmental time on jumpy neighbours. He added the Bogachiel Road reports to his file, which was now thick enough to require a second paper clip. He spread the notes across his desk and looked at the geographic distribution of the incidents, plotting them mentally on the map of the county he had carried in his head for 20 years. And he saw, looking at them this way, what he had been dimly aware of for some time, but had not allowed himself to state directly until this moment. The incidents formed a perimeter. Not a perfect one. Not a clean geometric shape with sharp corners and consistent spacing. But a perimeter nonetheless. A loose, irregular ring of disturbance and movement and spooked livestock and fast, unidentifiable things in the night. And the area it enclosed included the roads between Forks and La Push, and the forested territory north and east of town, and, among other things, the road that led to the Cullen house. He sat with this observation for a long time. He sat with the weight of it, the implication of it, the way it connected things he had been keeping in separate mental compartments and revealed them as parts of a single picture that was still incomplete, but was considerably more coherent than it had been an hour ago. He did not write the connection down. Some things he had found were better held in the mind than committed to paper, at least until you had enough of the surrounding context to give them the proper frame. Writing something down before you had the frame made it look like something it might not be. He kept the observation in his mind and let it sit there and continued to add things to the paper file and continued to drive the northern roads in the evenings and continued to watch. He mentioned the reports to Bella on a Wednesday evening, and with the careful casualness he had developed for testing what she already knew by measuring her response to what he said. Getting some unusual reports from the north and east sectors, he said, passing the bread. Movement, sounds in the forest, residents finding it unsettling enough to call it in. Bella looked at him across the table. The look lasted a fraction of a second longer than the remark warranted. The tiny pause of internal calculation that she had gotten better at concealing over the months but had not entirely eliminated. What kind of movement? Fast, he said. Large. Things people can see at the tree line but not identify. No tracks. He kept his voice the voice of a man sharing a professional observation. animals spooked on the farms north of town. Our pattern's been consistent for about 6 weeks. She moved her fork through her food in that way she had. Could be something migrating through. A bear, maybe. They cover a lot of ground. Bear behavior doesn't produce this distribution, Charlie said mildly, and bears leave tracks. She looked at him with the steady, composed expression she had developed over months of conversations like this one. The expression that was not deceptive in the active sense, but that was certainly selective. Have you talked to the wildlife office about it? Jeff's been tracking it, Charlie said. He sent measurements to a specialist at the university. The specialist said the data didn't fit any documented regional species. He paused, watching her. Used the word baffling. Something moved across her face, quickly, too quickly to fully read. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of someone receiving information that confirmed something they already knew, rather than introduced something new. She looked back at her plate. That's strange, she said. It is strange, Charlie agreed, and let it rest there. And they finished dinner talking about other things. He drove the northern roads the following Friday, a clear night by Fork standards, with the cloud cover thin enough for stars in the gaps, and pulled over at the wide point on the Bogachil Road, and turned off his lights and sat in the dark with his window down and listened. The forest was quiet, specifically and directionally quiet. The silence not of emptiness, but of occupied space, and the quality he had come to know over months of these drives as the sound of something present and aware and choosing not to be visible. The hair on the back of his neck rose in the particular way it rose in situations where the professional and the instinctual were registering the same signal from different angles. He felt, with the clarity of physical certainty, that he was being watched. I know you're there, he said, to the tree line, to the dark, to whatever was in the dark that was watching him with the patience of something that did not need this to resolve quickly. His voice was quiet and even, the voice he used in situations where he needed to project calm, regardless of what he was feeling. I don't know exactly what you are, but I know you're there, and I know you've been there, and I know you're doing something out here that you consider important. He paused. I'm not here to interfere with it. I just want you to know that I see you, even if I can't see you. The silence held for perhaps 15 seconds. Then something changed in the quality of it, a shift that he felt rather than heard, the difference between a room that is occupied and a room that has just been vacated. And then it was the ordinary nighttime quiet of the rural forest, and Charlie was alone in his cruiser with the stars visible in the cloud gaps and the empty road ahead of him. He sat for a moment longer. Then he started the car and drove home. He called Billy the next morning from the station on his lunch break, and this time he did not approach what he wanted to say from any angle other than directly. The perimeter, he said. The movement, the sounds, the incidents on the farms. I've mapped it. I can see the shape of it. Billy was quiet. I need to know, Charlie said, whether what's inside the perimeter is what I think it is. Another silence, longer than the first. Then Billy said, carefully, and with the weight of someone choosing honesty at some cost to the protective habits of many months. What do you think it is? I think the boys are holding a line, Charlie said. I think whatever has been generating those incidents is being kept out of a specific area, and I think the specific area includes my house and Bella's truck and the Cullen property." He stopped. "I think what's on the outside of that line is connected to the Seattle situation in ways I can't prove professionally but can see clearly enough." The silence on Billy's end had a different quality now. Not the silence of deliberation, but of acknowledgement. Of a man sitting with the fact that another man had gotten further than expected and deciding what that meant for how to proceed. "You're not wrong," Billy said finally. "Just that." "Are the boys safe?" Charlie asked. "Specifically, against what's out there?" "They are built for it," Billy said, "more specifically than I can explain. But yes, they are exactly what is needed for exactly this situation, and they are good at it, and they are holding." Charlie absorbed this. He thought about Jacob's bearing, the new physical confidence, and the responsibility behind his eyes that Charlie had been observing for months without having the context to understand. He thought about Billy saying not just a kid, not anymore, and understood now with more completeness what that meant and what it had cost, and why the pride and the grief in Billy's voice when he said it were proportional to each other. "Is it almost done?" Charlie asked. "It's moving toward resolution," Billy said. "I believe that. I can't give you a date or a guarantee, but the shape of things is moving toward an end." Charlie looked out his office window at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon life of Forks and thought about shapes moving toward ends and about all the things happening in the forests and on the roads of his county that were not visible from the window of a police station and that were not going to be resolved by any resource or framework his professional life had equipped him with. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me as much as you have. Over all of it, the months of it." "You would have gotten there anyway," Billy said. "You were always going to get there. I was just trying to make sure you got there at the right pace." A pause. "For everyone's sake." He drove home that evening through the familiar roads and pulled into his driveway as the sky was darkening and the first real rain of the week was beginning against the windshield. Bella's truck was there. The kitchen light was on. He could see her moving behind the window, the ordinary silhouette of a person in a kitchen at the end of an ordinary day. And Key sat in the cruiser and looked at the kitchen window and thought about perimeters and the people holding them and the ordinary warm light behind the glass that existed because of things happening in the dark forest that Bella's father was the last to know about and the least equipped to address. He got out of the car. He went inside. He checked the locks with a thoroughness he brought to it every night. He stood at the back window for a moment and looked at the tree line. Then he turned on the porch light and went to tell his daughter he was home. The night was quiet. Somewhere out in the dark, on the perimeter of things he couldn't see, people he trusted were doing the work that needed doing. The rain came down on Forks with its customary patience, and the porch light held its small circle of yellow against the dark, and the house was warm, and his daughter was in it. It was enough. It had to be enough. And on this particular night, standing in the kitchen with the rain on the windows and the smell of whatever Bella had made for dinner still in the air, it actually was. There was a period in July, spanning perhaps 3 weeks, where Charlie stopped actively resisting the situation and started simply observing it. He was not sure when exactly the shift happened. It was not a decision he made consciously on a specific morning or evening. It was more the gradual arrival of a condition that had been approaching for some time, and the way acceptance sometimes came not through a single resolution, but through the slow exhaustion of all the alternatives. He had been resisting for months. He had been cataloguing his resistance, maintaining it, returning to it after periods of grudging acknowledgement, and somewhere in the accumulation of those months, it had worn down to something quieter and more honest, something that looked less like opposition and more like a man finally agreeing to see what was actually in front of him. What was in front of him was Edward Cullen, on his couch, on Wednesday evenings and Saturday afternoons, with a consistency that had by this point made itself simply part of the structure of the week. And what Charlie found, when he stopped spending his observational energy on resistance and directed it instead toward actual looking, was a more complicated picture than the one he had been carrying. He had been telling himself a simple version of the story for months. The simple version went, Edward Cullen was dangerous in ways Charlie could feel but not identify. He had hurt Bella badly by leaving and was going to hurt her again. His family was strange, and his presence was a threat, and Bella's attachment to him represented a failure of her judgment that Charlie could not fix, but could at least refuse to endorse. This version was not dishonest. Every element of it was based on something real, but it was incomplete in ways that Charlie, who prided himself on working with complete pictures rather than partial ones, had been allowing himself to overlook because the complete picture was more uncomfortable than the simple version, and the complete picture included the following things, which Charlie assembled over the course of those July weeks with the deliberate fairness of a man who understood that his personal feelings about a situation were not a substitute for accurate observation of it. Edward Cullen had come back. He had come back after Bella nearly fell apart in his absence, and whatever his reasons were for leaving in the first place, whatever judgment about Bella's best interests or his own nature had driven that decision, the fact of the return was not the behavior of someone who did not care about the person he had left. Charlie had seen people who didn't care about the people they left. He had dealt with them professionally and had taken their statements and filed their reports and watched the particular way they occupied the same space as their damage without registering it. Edward did not look like that. Edward looked like someone who was aware of the damage he had caused and was conducting himself with a specific and sustained carefulness that was, Charlie understood, when he looked at it directly, an attempt at accountability. Edward was also, Charlie had to acknowledge, genuinely attentive to Bella in a way that could not be explained as strategy or performance. He had been watching Edward on his couch for months and had been watching for the seams of performance, the moments where the presentation dropped or shifted or revealed itself as something other than what it appeared to be. The seams weren't there. What was there? Consistently and without variation across every visit Charlie had observed, was the complete orientation of one person toward another that he had first noticed in January and had been trying to explain away ever since. It was the attention of someone for whom Bella's presence was the organizing fact of the room, and it was, Charlie had finally accepted, real. He did not like it any better for being real, but he had reached the point where his not liking it was a fact about him rather than a fact about the situation, and those were different things that deserved to be kept separate. He had the conversation with Edward on a Wednesday evening in mid-July. Bella was in the kitchen and making tea, which she sometimes did at that hour, and Edward was on the couch. When Charlie came in from the back porch where he had been sitting with a beer and the early evening air, and sat down in his armchair and looked at the young man on his couch with the direct and unambiguous attention of someone who had decided to say a specific thing and was not going to approach it from the side. "I want to say something to you," Charlie said, "and I want you to let me say the whole thing before you respond." Edward looked at him with that quality of complete attention, the full orientation. "Of course," he said. "I don't trust you," Charlie said. "I want to be honest with you about that, because I think you already know it, and pretending otherwise would be insulting to both of us. I don't trust you because you left, and what happened to Bella when you left is something I'm not over, and I don't know if I'm going to get over it." He paused. "That's the first thing." Edward said nothing. His expression was still and serious and showed no defensiveness, which Charlie noted. "The second thing," Charlie continued, "is that I've been watching you for 7 months. Every time you've been in this house, I've been watching you the way I watch people when I'm trying to understand what they actually are, rather than what they're presenting. And what I've seen is that you are careful with her, consistently, specifically careful, in ways that I don't think she always notices, but that I notice because it's what I do." He stopped again, because the next part was the part that cost him something to say. "I'm not saying I understand it, or that I like it, or that I think this situation is a good one, but I'm saying I've seen it, and I'm not going to pretend I haven't." Edward was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even and unhurried, carrying the specific weight of someone who was not going to offer reassurances they couldn't sustain. "I know what I did to her," he said. "I'm not going to ask you to set that aside. You shouldn't set that aside. It's one of the things I have to be accountable for, and you holding it is appropriate." He paused. "What I can tell you is that every decision I make when I'm with her is made with her well-being as the first consideration. Not my preferences, not what I want, her. That's not a performance. That's what I'm actually doing." Charlie looked at him across the living room in the early evening light, the television off for once, the house quiet around them. He believed him. He did not want to believe him, and believing him did not resolve the other things he felt about the situation, but he looked at Edward Cullen and believed that the statement was honest. "She's going to make choices that I can't stop," Charlie said. "I've understood that for a while. What I need to know is that whoever she makes those choices with is actually going to be there, not going to disappear again when it gets complicated, not going to make a decision about what's best for her without asking her." "I'm not going anywhere," Edward said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of elaboration or qualification, carried its own kind of weight. Bella came back in from the kitchen with 3 mugs of tea, which told Charlie she had been aware enough of the tenor of the room to include one for him without being asked, and the conversation shifted into lighter territory, and Charlie drank his tea and watched the two of them with the new quality of attention he had been developing, the attention of someone who was looking at the actual thing rather than the story he had been telling about the thing. What he saw, watching them that evening with his resistance mostly set aside, was something that he found both difficult and clarifying. Bella was different with Edward than she was anywhere else. not different in the way of someone performing for an audience or managing a relationship with strategic attention, but different in the way of someone who had located, in the presence of this specific person, a version of themselves that they didn't have access to elsewhere. She was more direct, more willing to say the actual thing rather than the diplomatic approximation of it. She laughed differently, less carefully. She sat in the particular way of someone who was not monitoring how she was sitting because the person beside her did not require her to manage herself. Charlie recognized this uncomfortably and specifically. He recognized it because it was the thing you hoped, as a parent, that your child would find with someone, the person in whose presence they became more themselves rather than less. And he had been hoping it would be Jacob because Jacob was safe and known and comprehensible and did not make Charlie's instincts stand at attention every time he walked through the door. But wanting it to be Jacob did not make it Jacob, and refusing to see that it was Edward did not make it not Edward. The evidence was what the evidence was, and 20 years of professional practice had given Charlie an obligation to the evidence that his personal preferences could not override. He thought about Jacob. He thought about Jacob regularly during this period, with the specific and helpless grief of someone watching a person they care about absorb a pain they cannot reduce. Jacob was still coming by occasionally, less than before, and the visits had the quality of someone maintaining a connection out of genuine feeling rather than strategic intent, which was both admirable and difficult to witness. Jacob sat on his couch and was warm and uncomplicated and everything Charlie had wanted for his daughter. And then he went home, and Bella's attention went back to the place it was always oriented. And there was nothing Charlie could do with any of that except feel it and set it down and pick it up again the next time. He called Renee in the 3rd week of July. They had been talking more frequently lately, or more honestly, which was perhaps the more accurate description since the frequency had not substantially changed, but the content had. Renee had a quality of breezy acceptance about Edward that Charlie found in his current state of partial and reluctant revision, simultaneously irritating and instructive. He loves her, Renee said on this call, in the tone of someone stating something that did not require extensive analysis. Whatever else is going on, that part is pretty obvious. You've met him twice, Charlie said. I know, Renee said, but you can see some things very quickly if you're not trying to see something else. Charlie considered this with the honesty it deserved and did not entirely dismiss it. Renee was perceptive in ways that she did not always receive credit for, her breezy presentation being something that people, including Charlie across 20 years of knowing her, sometimes mistook for shallowness when it was actually a different species of intelligence, one that operated through feeling and impression rather than systematic analysis. I don't know what he is, Charlie said, which was more honest than he had intended. There was a brief pause. What do you mean? I mean there's something about him I can't place, Charlie said. Something that doesn't fit inside the ordinary description of a person. I've felt it since I first met him, and I've never been able to get more specific than that. He paused. It's probably nothing. It's probably just me not being able to accept that she's with someone I didn't choose for her. Renee was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was being more careful than she usually was. Or it's your instincts doing what they do, she said, which have always been pretty good. Another pause. Either way, she's happy, Charlie. Whatever you think about him, she's happy in a way I haven't seen in a long time. Maybe ever. He sat with this after the call ended and added it to the collection of things he was sitting with. The accumulating archive of this summer's observations and conversations and reluctant revisions. The evening of the last Saturday in July, Charlie sat on the back porch after dinner while Bella and Edward were in the living room, and he did something he had been doing less of lately, which was to simply let the situation be what it was without applying his analysis to it. The evening air was cool and smelled like rain that had not yet arrived, and the tree line was dark against the greying sky, and the sounds of the living room came through the open window behind him. Voices and occasional quiet laughter, and the ordinary ambient sound of two people occupying a shared space with ease. He thought about what it had cost him to get to this porch on this evening. The months of resistance and the nights of lying awake and the conversations that circled and the feelings that didn't resolve. He thought about what it had cost Bella, who had been managing his resistance alongside everything else she was managing, with a patience that he now acknowledged was more than he had had the right to expect. He was not at peace with the situation. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, because there was a difference between accepting something and being at peace with it, and he was somewhere in the territory of the former without having fully arrived at the latter. There were still things he didn't trust, still things that stood at attention in him when Edward Cullen was in his house, still the deep, parental unease that came from sensing something he couldn't name. But Bella was happy. Renee was right about that, and Charlie was right about it too, had been right about it for months, while choosing to look past it toward the complications. She was happy in the specific way of someone who had found what they were looking for, the complete happiness that was not absence of difficulty, but presence of the right person to face the difficulty with. He stayed on the porch until the rain came, which was not long. Then he went inside and said goodnight to Edward with a civility that was genuine rather than performed, and Edward said goodnight with the same quality, and Bella looked at both of them with an expression that Charlie recognized as relief, the specific relief of someone who has been waiting for two things they love to find their way to a livable coexistence. It was not everything. It was not trust, and it was not approval, and it was not the resolution of the things that still stood at attention in him when he thought about Edward Cullen too carefully. But it was a beginning, or perhaps more accurately, it was an acknowledgement. An acknowledgement was, in Charlie's experience, where most things that eventually became better had to start. He checked the locks. He turned on the porch light. He went to bed and thought about Jacob, the way he always thought about Jacob on these evenings, with the grief of something that had not worked out the way it should have in a just world. And then he thought about Bella on the couch and the way she sat when she was not monitoring herself, and the happiness that Renee had named and that Charlie had been watching all along, and he let both of those things be true at the same time, the grief and the gladness, because that was what the situation was, and he had committed on this particular July evening to seeing the situation as it was. The rain came down on the roof above him in his patient Forks way, and the porch light held outside, and the house was quiet, and his daughter was home. He closed his eyes. The evidence was what the evidence was, He let himself believe it. The camping trip was Bella's idea, or at least that was how she presented it, which Charlie noted without pressing on, because the distinction between Bella's idea and an idea she had been given and had adopted as her own had become, over the preceding months, a line he could feel but rarely locate with precision. She mentioned it on a Monday evening at dinner, casually, in the way she mentioned things she had already decided and was informing him of, rather than proposing for discussion. The Cullens were going camping in the mountains for a few days. She wanted to go. She thought it would be good. A chance to be outside, to be away from town for a bit. Charlie looked at her across the table and conducted the internal assessment he conducted whenever she brought him something like this. The weighing of his unease against his commitment to not letting that unease become the kind of control that damaged rather than protected. He asked the questions a reasonable parent asked. Where specifically were they going? How long? Who was going? Was Carlyle going to be there? Bella answered with the patient thoroughness of someone who had anticipated the questions and prepared for them, which was itself information about how much she had thought about how to present this. The mountains north of Forks. 2 or 3 days, depending on weather. The whole family, including Carlyle and Esme. They had done it before, she said, knew the area well, and had the equipment and the experience. She would have her phone, though reception in the mountains was unreliable, which he should expect and not worry about. He did not say what he was thinking, which was that the mountains north of Forks were currently the location of whatever had been generating the incident reports he had been tracking for 2 months, and that sending his daughter into that territory felt, in his stomach, like exactly the wrong thing to do. He did not say this because he did not have a way to explain why he was thinking it, not in terms that would lead anywhere other than the conversation he could not yet have, the one that required information he did not officially possess. He said yes with conditions. She would check in when she had reception. She would be home by Sunday evening. She would not go anywhere alone, at which he said in the tone of a general parental instruction, rather than the specific and directed concern it actually was. Bella said yes to all of it, and left the following Thursday morning with a bag and the composed certainty of someone who knew where they were going and why, and had already made their peace with the fact that their father was going to spend the intervening days in a state of low-grade worry about it. She was not wrong about that. The house was different when she was gone. Not empty in any dramatic sense. Not the hollow quality of those 4 months the previous year when her absence had been a presence of its own. This was simpler and less terrible. Just the ordinary quietness of a house occupied by one person instead of 2. The particular acoustic quality of rooms where no one is about to come downstairs. Charlie had lived alone before Bella came to Forks. He knew the shape of it. It had simply become less familiar over the past year and a half, and the refamiliarization was its own small discomfort. He ate dinner alone on Thursday and watched the game and went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay awake for a while and then slept and told himself this was fine. It was a camping trip. Families went camping. There was nothing exceptional about any of it. Friday passed without incident. He went to work, dealt with the ordinary business of the department, drove a brief afternoon patrol on the northern roads, partly from habit and partly from the compulsion to see what there was to see, and found the forest in a state he had not encountered before in all the months of these drives. It was not quiet in the charged waiting way of recent weeks. It was active. He could feel it, the sense of a situation in motion rather than a situation held in place, and the distinction registered in his chest with a clarity that had nothing to do with professional training and everything to do with the accumulated months of paying attention to something he couldn't name. He drove home and made notes in his file and sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet house and thought about Bella in the mountains and about what active meant and whether it was the kind of active that moved toward the resolution Billy had described or a different and less comfortable kind. Billy called on Friday evening. This was not unusual in timing, but was unusual in initiation, since it was Billy calling him rather than the other direction, which happened less often, and which Charlie had come to associate with Billy having a specific purpose for the call, rather than simply wanting company. He answered on the second ring. "How are you doing?" Billy asked, in the tone that meant he already knew the answer and was giving Charlie the opportunity to say it out loud rather than carry it alone. "I've been better," Charlie said honestly. "She's in the mountains." "I know," Billy said. There was a particular quality to those two words that Charlie sat with for a moment. Not the "I know" of general awareness, the "I know" of someone who had specific and current knowledge of the situation. Charlie filed this and did not press on it, because Billy's specific and current knowledge of things Charlie didn't have access to had been, across all the months of this, I consistently pointed in the direction of Bella's safety rather than her danger, and tonight was not the night to start doubting that pattern. "Tell me something that isn't about any of this," Charlie said. "Just talk to me about something ordinary." And Billy did. He talked about the dock repair he had finally gotten to, the new boards, and the particular difficulty of getting the angle right on the far post. He talked about a fishing tournament being organized for late August on the reservation, whether Charlie would be interested in participating. He talked about a movie he had watched the previous night that had been better than expected, and a book Jacob had apparently recommended to him that he had started and was reserving judgment on. He talked for nearly an hour about things that were entirely real and grounded and present tense, and Charlie sat in his kitchen in the quiet house and listened and felt the specific value of being talked to about ordinary things by a person who understood why the ordinary things were necessary. Near the end of the call, Billy said, without transitioning to it in any particular way, "She's going to be home Sunday." "That's what she told me," Charlie said. "I know," Billy said again, with the same quality as before. And then, quietly, with the measured certainty of someone offering the most honest thing they had available, "It's going to be okay, Charlie. What's happening right now, tonight, it's moving the right direction." Charlie held the phone and looked at the dark window over the sink. "Tonight specifically?" A pause. "Tonight specifically," Billy confirmed. And Charlie said goodnight and sat with the phone in his hand for a while after the call ended. He thought about what tonight specifically meant and what Billy would have needed to know in order to say it, and arrived at conclusions he chose not to pursue too explicitly, because pursuing them would have required him to either act on them or sit with the full weight of them, and neither option was available to him in any productive form at 10 o'clock on a Friday night in his kitchen. He checked the logs. He turned on the porch light. He went to bed and slept eventually, with the broken quality of a night where the mind was not fully convinced that sleep was appropriate, but the body had run out of arguments. He woke at 3:17 in the morning. He did not know why. There was no sound that had woken him, no disturbance in the house, no external trigger he could identify. He simply came out of sleep with the abrupt completeness of someone whose nervous system had decided that sleeping was finished, and he lay in the dark for a few minutes, and then got up and went downstairs and made a cup of tea he didn't especially want, and sat at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn quiet of the house. Outside the window, the night was still. The porch light held its circle on the empty driveway. The street beyond was dark and quiet and empty in the way of very early morning. That particular stillness that belonged to the hours between when night people went to sleep and when day people woke up. Charlie sat with his tea and the stillness and thought about nothing specific, or rather, let his mind move across the surface of the things it moved across without directing it toward any of them. He thought about Bella at 7, learning to fish at the river, her patience for it better than he had expected, her absolute refusal to touch the fish when it came to that part. He thought about the first time she had driven his cruiser in an empty parking lot on a Sunday. Her face a study in concentration, the way she had corrected the wheel with more precision than he expected from someone who had barely driven before. He thought about graduation, the photograph he had taken that was slightly blurry because his hands had been less steady than he intended, and how he was going to get it framed anyway. He went back to bed at 4:30 and slept until 7, and woke with the particular clarity of someone who has processed something in sleep that they could not process awake. Saturday was quiet. He cleaned the house, which needed it. He fixed the kitchen window latch, finally, the slightly loose one he had been meaning to fix since February, and the small satisfaction of a thing done that had been undone for too long was genuine and specific and grounding in the way that completed practical tasks were grounding. He drove a patrol in the afternoon and found the forest along the northern roads in a state that was different again from Friday, quieter now in a way that felt conclusive rather than charged. The difference between the quiet of something in progress and the quiet of something finished. He stood at the side of the road for a moment with his window down and the engine off, and listened to that quiet and felt, with the same physical certainty with which he had felt the watching in these woods weeks ago, that something had resolved. He could not have said what. He could not have produced evidence or a case file or a professional account of the basis for the feeling. He felt it with his body, and with the accumulated attentiveness of months of paying attention to these roads and these trees and the things that moved through them. And the feeling was not ambiguous. Something had finished, and the finishing had gone, as Billy had said it would, the right direction. He drove home and made dinner and ate it at the kitchen table with Bella's empty chair across from him, and thought about Sunday and her coming home. And Anne felt a quality of anticipation that was cleaner and lighter than anything he had felt in several weeks. Bella came home Sunday evening. He heard the truck in the driveway at 6:40, which was within the terms of what she had promised, and he had the particular relief of the timing itself before the door even opened. Then she came in, and he looked at her. She looked tired in the way of someone who had not slept adequately, or had slept in conditions that were physically demanding. She looked like someone who'd been outside for several days in the actual outdoors, rather than the simulated outdoors of comfortable camping. Her hair needed attention. There was a mark on her forearm that she was not drawing attention to, and that he filed silently and without comment. But there was something else in her face that was different from the tired. Something underneath it that he spent the first several minutes of her arrival trying to locate and name. It was not the happiness of a person who had had an enjoyable trip, though she performed something adjacent to that when he asked how it was, and she said fine, good, beautiful up there, which was technically a description of the territory rather than an account of what had actually happened. It was not relief, though there was an element of relief in it. It was something quieter and more settled than either of those, the expression of a person who had come through something and knew they had come through it, who was carrying a new weight but carrying it with a steadiness that had not been there before. He recognized this expression. He had seen versions of it on people who had been through significant experiences and had emerged changed, not damaged but altered, knowing something now that they hadn't known before and integrating that knowledge into who they were. He had seen it on his own face once in the mirror after a situation early in his career that he did not often think about. He had not expected to see it on his daughter at 18, and the seeing of it was both reassuring and sobering in equal measure. He made her eat something. She sat at the kitchen table and ate the soup he heated without argument, which was itself a form of communication from someone who frequently had opinions about being managed. And he sat across from her and kept the conversation light and let her come back to herself at the pace she was coming back. "Everything okay?" he asked, after she had eaten and the edge of the tiredness had smoothed slightly. "Yes," she said. And then, with a quality of honesty that was different from the careful deflections of the past months, it was a hard few days in some ways, but it worked out. Everything worked out. He looked at her face when she said it worked out, and believed her in the fullest way he had believed her about anything in a long time. Not because the statement was complete or because it explained anything he didn't know, but because the expression behind it had the quality of truth that he had spent 20 years learning to recognize and could not mistake now. "Good," he said. "I'm glad." She went to bed early, which was the most normal and expected thing she had done since arriving home, and which he found for that reason deeply reassuring. He cleaned up the kitchen and walked through the house in the evening quiet and let the familiar sounds and surfaces of the place settle him back toward the ordinary rhythm of things. The report came across his desk on Monday morning. A forwarded item from a Park Services liaison about a fire in a remote mountain clearing, ash and debris discovered by a forestry survey team working the upper Cascades. The report was brief and professional and noted that the burn pattern was inconsistent with a natural fire, the fuel source undetermined, the extent of the burn suggesting a significant and rapid conflagration in an area with no obvious human infrastructure to explain the ignition, and Park Services was flagging it for follow-up, but noting that the location was sufficiently remote and the burn sufficiently complete that the prospects for meaningful investigation were limited. Charlie read the report twice. He looked at the coordinates, which he had to convert to map references mentally, and located them in the general territory of the mountains north of Forks. in the general territory of where his daughter had gone camping. He sat at his desk for a long time after that. He looked at his map on the wall, the one with the pins, and added the burn location in his mind without physically adding a pin, and looked at where it fell in relation to everything else he had been mapping for months, and felt the pieces of the picture arranging themselves into a shape that was more complete than it had been, though still not complete enough to see fully. He thought about the forest on Saturday afternoon, the quality of finished quiet. He thought about Billy saying tonight specifically. He thought about Bella's face when she said everything worked out, the particular and unambiguous quality of the truth behind it. He thought about the mark on her forearm that he had filed silently and without comment. He looked at the burn report for a long time. Then he set it in the file, the paper file, with everything else he had been accumulating, and closed the file and put it in the bottom drawer of his desk and closed the drawer. He went back to work. He did his job. He drove his patrol that afternoon on the northern roads and found them quiet in the settled way of the past 2 days. The charged, waiting quality entirely gone, and the forest simply a forest on a grey Pacific Northwest afternoon, with the rain coming in from the coast and the light failing early, the way it always did this time of year. He drove home. He checked the locks. He turned on the porch light. He sat at the kitchen table after dinner and thought about all the things he had collected in the bottom drawer of his desk and in his paper file and in the careful internal space where he kept the things that didn't fit his professional frameworks. And he thought about what a man did with all of that, what the right and responsible thing was to do with a year's worth of observations that added up to a picture he did not have the vocabulary to describe. He decided, had sitting in his kitchen in the quiet of a Monday evening with the porch light on outside and his daughter's boots by the door and the rain on the windows, that what he did was trust. Not the trust of ignorance, not the trust of someone who hadn't been paying attention. The trust of someone who had been paying attention, who had seen enough of the shape of things to understand that the people involved were doing what needed to be done with more capability than he possessed, and that his job was not to see the full picture, but to keep the light on and the door open and the house ready for his daughter's return. She came downstairs at 9 for a glass of water and found him at the table. "You're up late," she said. "Just thinking," he said. She poured her water and stood at the counter and looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say something. "About anything specific?" He looked at his daughter standing in his kitchen in her pajamas, with her hair down and the mark on her forearm and the new settled quality behind her eyes, and he thought about everything he knew and everything he didn't and everything he had decided to trust. "About how glad I am you're home," he said, which was true, which was the most important true thing available. She smiled at him, a real one, and said good night and went back upstairs, and Charlie sat in the kitchen for a while longer, with the rain on the windows and the porch light on outside and the house quiet around him. He went to bed. He slept without interruption, the complete sleep of a man who had decided, finally and with full information, what he was going to carry and what he was going to set down. The porch light stayed on. It always did. Charlie Swan never knew the full story. He knew the shape of it, the shadows and the weight of it, the way it pressed against the edges of his ordinary life without ever fully breaking through. He knew his daughter loved someone he didn't entirely understand, and was loved in return with an intensity that had frightened him and finally, reluctantly, moved him. He knew the boys on the reservation carried themselves like men who had already decided what they were willing to pay. He knew that Forks, his quiet, rainy town, was not as quiet as it had always seemed, but he also knew this. Bella came home, night after night, through everything he couldn't see and couldn't name and couldn't protect her from, as she came home. There is a kind of faith that lives not in understanding but in trust. The faith a father extends when the doors close and the maps run out, and all that remains is the belief that the person he raised will find their way through the dark. Charlie kept the porch light on, every night, without fail. Not because he knew what was out there, but because she would always have a light to come back to. So close your eyes now. Let Forks go quiet around you and drift gently into sleep.